that's not what I had signed up for. I watched the whole fucking thing. I was like, oh, come on, have just get back. And you start getting all annoyed. And they're like the first 10 minutes, all three of them are talking. Is like a reporter hangout. It's kind of weird too. Just not what I was hoping for, as well. So, um, I think I got YouTube on. Checking my phone. We'll start. If I do, welcome everybody, Stoney Progressive, or welcome you. One or two of you people who are usually waiting. All right, I'm gonna get going. I'm not waiting. I'm usually on more close to midnight, so usually that's when my regulars start joining. Is midnight. I'm trying to stream a little bit longer, so I've been starting earlier, going a little longer. I still have more people late at night, so this is super early for me. Getting the important stuff early. That's genius shit, Todd. Good stuff. Stay stony. Let's get high. No, not that one.
Today is Michael Tracy. He is an independent journalist who recently returned or left Poland. He's in the UK at the moment, but he actually went to Poland in order to chase the stories that other people aren't really interested in sharing. He's spoken with
Yeah,
a few
welcome in
Canadian
YouTube.
refugees
Let's
as well as members of the
this
82nd
conversation
Airborne, a division of the U.S.
is
Army, which was recently
Michael
deployed to Poland.
Tracy.
Michael,
Jesus,
welcome to the Gray Zone and to Red Lines.
on Red
Thanks for
Lines
having me.
with Anya
So just start by
Premikel.
telling everyone why you decided to go to Poland and what has the reaction been since you showed up?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I spent around 3 weeks in Poland, mostly in the southeastern part of the country, in proximity to the border with Ukraine, because the impetus for my going was that the U.S. is clearly, manifestly waging a proxy war right now against Russia, and doing so with Ukraine as the main kind of front in the battle. And the fueling of that proxy war comes by way largely of Poland. So the U.S. has vastly increased the number of troops it deploys to Poland, both under the auspices of NATO and also under just an ordinary bilateral relationship between the U.S. and the Polish government, which have kind of close military ties and have done for quite some time. And so there are more troops now, U.S. troops now in Poland than there have been in decades. And and what are they doing? Well, they're doing a variety of things, and I wanted to sort of see, to the best of my ability, if I could get any in-person sense of how this was working out logistically. Because a lot of the journalists who want to cover the Ukraine war, they I think this is reasonable enough, flood into Ukraine itself, and they end up kind of clustering around the same, I don't know, modes of inquiry, let's put it that way, where they'll get the latest talking point updates from Ukraine government officials, and then they'll do these live shots for example, like a TV news show where they're in Lviv, which is in the western portion of Ukraine, and it's where most of the journalists seem to be concentrated, and they'll, kind of sternly and solemnly recount the latest sort of update, and with Lviv as a backdrop, and that's somehow like their big war reporting. I could have done that, I guess, but I thought it would be more fruitful to, as best I can, kind of ascertain the nature of this proxy war that the U.S. is waging. And I guess a couple of findings stick out. One of which is that the U.S. military is, as I was told directly by multiple soldiers, maintains a policy of quote unquote media blackout. That's not my term, that's their term. In terms of the access they're providing to journalists to their facilities. Now, if there was no media blackout and they were providing access, a lot of the access would be granted to preferred friendly journalists anyway, right? So they would be allow certain journalists, say from NBC or Fox or New York Times or Reuters or something, to take a kind of choreographed tour of these new installations that have been built up around Poland. And so there would be a lot of distortion and propaganda associated with that coverage. But they're not even doing that. They're not even allowing friendly,
Hmm.
favorably disposed journalists to get any kind of firsthand look at what the U.S. military is doing here. And this is not only me reporting it. I mean, go look at what journalists from places like these kind of military trade publications like military.com, Defense One. These are publications that cover like are in the sort of part and parcel with the defense industry. Even they say they're not getting access because there's a media blackout. Now, why is that there a media blackout? Well, I'm not sure exactly. There are a number of potential explanations. One of which is that the logistical involvement of the U.S. in funneling weapons to Ukraine has made it such that the nature of the American commitment right now in the war is more extensive than maybe has been publicly revealed, and so they
Right.
wouldn't want anybody to see like the ins and outs or mechanics of how that proxy war is being orchestrated. That's one possible explanation. I'm not asserting that's fact. I'm just kind of speculating as to what the reason would be for this shroud of secrecy covering a lot of the U.S. deployment in direct proximity to a major war zone. I mean, it seems like
Yeah.
not that many journalists are interested in pursuing this line. They'd rather fulminate with outrage about the latest Russian bombing or what have you, which I'm not discounting the utility of in every sense, but I think there's a major angle that's undercovered, which is like the actual mechanics of this proxy war.
Yeah, because we know, as you say, not only are there more US troops in Poland than have been for decades, this is also the US is right now overseeing the influx of weapons in Ukraine into Europe at a rate that we haven't seen even since World War II. So if that's happening while the sexy shots might be in Ukraine, we know that story so far is manifesting in Poland, which is why it makes sense that you went. And then you found that there was essentially a gag order on any discussion of this whatsoever. Then this was something that Fox News was actually able to confirm, correct?
Right. I mean, people when I mentioned this concept of a media blackout, first on Twitter, shortly after several soldiers told me that this was the policy. As usual, you get inundated, or at least I get inundated with a deluge of trolls and including other journalists telling me that I'm either making it up or lying or just trying to toot my own horn or whatever the latest insult is, which is
Damn.
fine, I can take it. But I wasn't making it up, and Tucker Carlson's
That's
producers
crazy. I just
contacted the Pentagon the day that I was on the show last week. It was last Tuesday, and they confirmed. I mean, the Pentagon confirmed that the policy imposed at these U.S. military installations throughout Poland, many of which have just been erected within the past couple months, the policy is a media blackout. So that's been now totally confirmed. And you would think that ought to heighten the amount of skepticism that journalists in particular have about the nature of what this military operation is. And we get more and more deployments announced of U.S. troops to Eastern Europe as the days go by and the war drags on. And yet there seems to be a total, if not only complacency, there seems to be like almost a celebration on the part of the media about how wonderful and virtuous these deployments are, with not a hint of skepticism really at all that I've seen. Because if you do express skepticism, as I'm sure you're aware, it immediately gets you castigated as somehow an apologist for Putin or whatever.
Right.
It's kind of all this knee jerk stuff that
but no, but
really
Russia's
has
spy.
bears no relation to what the actual journalism enterprise you're doing is, but opens you up to this kind of attack, which a lot of journalists don't really want to subject themselves to, because ultimately they're all conformists and they live for validation from their peers within these rarefied media circles, and they don't want to do anything to compromise that.
And they might not be skeptical because they actually actively support
Oh yeah, for sure.
US escalation in Ukraine. There are, I'm sure, plenty of journalists in the mainstream media who are taking privately, I mean, it shows through their reporting, but would like to see the Biden administration do more. I wanted to talk to you about what you did see in Poland.
Can I just make
There
a quick
was,
point real quick
yeah.
before I forget on the point about journalists? And this is going to be 20 seconds. But I heard directly from a translator working for an American journalist at a major outlet. Okay. Everybody would know this outlet. And this translator said that he or she directly facilitated the entry of American veterans into Ukraine to join this international legion. So this is a media, basically a American media worker admitting that they facilitated the deployment of what are being called, I think, understandably, mercenaries into Ukraine. So that kind of gives you some insight as to the potential biases going on here, perhaps.
Yeah, it's similar to what Max Blumenthal reported at the Gray Zone, that one of the main BBC fixers also happened to be running PR for the Ukrainian government aligned groups, and obviously is very passionate about escalation in Ukraine, and then was one of the individuals shaping their coverage of the alleged bombing of the theater in Mariupol, which we've also reported there are legitimate questions to be raised about what exactly went on there. Was it something that Azov was using in order to prompt more U.S. escalation in Ukraine? These are the kinds of questions, of course, we need to be asking as this plays out, because we saw what happened in Syria, that sometimes when the militants get desperate, they do resort to unfortunate tactics, and that's perhaps what we saw in Mariupol. But on the point
especially
of,
if they're reacting to what American politicians keep saying are red lines,
exactly,
that would prompt this kind of.
Whenever we say there's a red line,
like Rob
there's a
Portman,
magic
supposedly a
group
moderate
that does it.
Republican senator from Ohio, repeated just a few days ago that a red line ought to be chemical weapons attacks. So if it's in your interest as a Ukrainian combatant to provoke the entry of American military might into the war zone, then yeah, I mean, it's going to be rational in a sense to, if possible, conjure up some kind of incident that could precipitate that kind of intervention, as Syria demonstrated.
And you've written about the bipartisan push on Capitol Hill, Democrats and Republicans alike calling for escalation, and what you say, really engaging in kind of a pro-war fever that we haven't seen since 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the New York Times triumphantly reported, I think it was last week, that politicians in Washington are in this like joyous spell because the level of unity that they're experiencing isn't like anything since 9/11. And I don't know, I think the lesson of the post 9/11 period doesn't necessarily indicate that sort of unity yields the most positive policy outcomes, but the New York Times thinks it's just wonderful. And this needs to be preserved and held on to as like this really
propaganda
ennobling,
works.
kind of unifying.
When everybody's uniformed behind war, that means the New York Times, we
political
did
class
our
to do what?
jobs.
Well, of course,
The
it's
war
for a
propaganda
pro-war
we've been
end,
pushing,
which is
it's
to
finally worked. You did a good job,
facilitate
bonus. You did a good
and,
job, bonus.
exacerbate,
Of course they're happy.
warfare in Ukraine. I mean, Biden's demand on Saturday, this past weekend, for regime change, his call for Putin to essentially be ousted from power, is totally consistent with what U.S. policy is oriented towards. So this was just a matter of Biden, whether it was a scripted remark or not. I mean, I don't think there's really any evidence that it was somehow unscripted or ad-libbed. This was Biden delivering a formal speech at one of over the course of his most significant foreign trip yet as president in a capital of Poland, in Warsaw, Poland, which is like the key ally of the U.S. in enabling the facilitation of this proxy war. It sure seemed like he was reading off something to me when he made that final kind of climactic call for the ouster of Putin. But even if he wasn't, it doesn't particularly matter because it's an obvious reflection of what U.S. policy is kind of geared toward right now, which is ultimately the collapse of the Russian state. That's what the sanctions are intended to do. The UK Prime Minister's spokesperson, right after the invasion was launched, gave a statement admitting that the purpose of the sanctions was to oust Putin, and inflict enough pain upon Russian civilians that they will somehow magically vindicate American desires for regime change.
Yeah, this is the first time that I'm hearing high-level politicians such as Nancy Pelosi, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, actually admit that that's the goal of sanctions. They used to deny. They always say, oh, sanctions target individuals in the government. They're not designed to hurt the population. But across the board now, we're actually hearing them admit that these sanctions are designed to cause suffering
Sanctions are
among
war.
the Russian people. I
God's
think we
sake,
have that
this
clip in
man
case
cannot
people missed
remain
it.
in power. For God's sake, this man
We need
cannot
to end all
remain in
sanctions.
power.
Sanctions are war.
God bless you all. And may
All
God
sanctions are
defend
war.
our freedom, and may God protect our troops.
It's the
Thank
will of
you for your
God.
patience.
It
Yeah.
seems kind of theocratic to me, actually.
Yeah, and he was very. It was the closing of his address. He was really riled up in that moment, and so it's just amazing to watch U.S. officials scramble to now say that, oh, that wasn't really what the president meant. But I wanted to transition and really focus on what you saw in Poland, because your articles have been really great and really just well written, I should say, when you're speaking with soldiers and speaking with the refugees that you met, the Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Let's start with the U.S. 82nd Airborne, recently deployed to Poland. You had the chance to walk among them in the streets and see firsthand their conditions and their mindset. What was your impression of their experience there right now?
Well, there was an article that I wrote, I think around 2 weeks ago now, deriving from my interactions with members of the 82nd Airborne that had been deployed to the Krakow, Poland area. So this is a little bit westward from the Ukraine border. So it's not a border area, which is it's more southwestern Poland, but there's a sizable U.S. troop presence there at the moment. And it's sort of interesting, or even a little bit bizarre, because what they often seem to be doing in this area of Poland anyway is sightseeing. So their stated mission is one of quote unquote reassurance. So they're not really supposed to be doing much of anything except just being physically present in Poland. And so they have to fill their time with something. And so they walk around Krakow, go into like tourist areas and eating at restaurants. And, so I was able to kind of talk to.
I would love to know if I can.
And
do I know
they're
anybody
kind of
that can
being kept in the
confirm
dark
this?
themselves about what the purpose of this deployment is. They get kind of incremental updates from military intelligence officers about the status of things in Ukraine, but a lot of it is just the same kind of open source information that anybody with Twitter or Telegram or Instagram or Discord can get. So it's not like they're being fed high level info. And so their presence is just to kind of give this psychic kind of mollification to Poles or in the Polish government, because there is a strong current of paranoia coursing through Poland. And I don't want to totally discount that paranoia as 100% unfounded in every respect. I mean, this is a country, Poland, that was largely destroyed in World War II and then under the thumb of the Soviet Union for decades. And, I think they have fears and anxieties that a lot of Americans probably can't themselves really identify with. But at the same time, you talk to people throughout Poland, and it's interesting. The number one response that I would get from younger people, younger Poles, when I asked like just what do they think about the war situation, what do they think the proper response should be from their government, they just don't want to talk about it. I mean, they kind of want to just block it out of their minds and pretend it's not happening because they don't even want to contemplate the potential enormity of what could potentially be coming for Poland, because it keeps getting prophesied that Poland is next in line for invasion.
Right.
Meaning Putin's not going to stop at Ukraine. He's going to go Moldova or Baltics and eventually to Poland. And, I don't want to make a prediction about anything, but I don't see a whole lot of basis for that belief, at least at the moment. I mean, it's possible, but the certitude with which a lot of Poles express their conviction that this is an inevitability if Putin is not, quote, stopped in Ukraine, it doesn't always strike you as particularly well founded. And it's interesting because me being in Poland, there were some Poles who agree with my general outlook on this situation. They're in the extreme minority, but they do exist. And so I met separately with a right-wing politician and a left-wing activist figure who was affiliated with one of the left-wing parties. And it was sort of interesting because they both use the same exact word to describe to me their impression of what the Polish populace is sort of encumbered by at the moment. And they both use the word madness. They say it's just total, extreme, almost unfathomable madness what Poland is thinking at the moment in terms of their belief that they could potentially exert some sort of new Polish foreign policy might and get involved in Ukraine in some sense, even if it means, there's every couple of days there seems to be a new proposal floated by Polish government officials about some sort of peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, and then if you look at the at least superficial reporting on it, it gets bucked by the Biden administration, whether it's this transfer of MiG jets that was scuttled, or just last week there was a proposal from the head of the ruling Conservative Party to do this peacekeeping humanitarian corridor mission, and that doesn't seem to have been endorsed by the American government either. But anyway, so there's this need for some kind of psychic reassurance, right, according to American government officials, and that's why a pretty significant cross section of these U.S. troops are there. They're just hanging out, which is bizarre. But then when you get closer to the Ukraine border, that's where the secrecy ramps up, right? That's where there's a much more stringent prohibition on any engagement with media. That's where the soldiers have a much tighter lid on them to prevent them from providing any kind of OPSEC details, even though OPSEC doesn't seem to really exist that much anymore because everybody can put out their own intelligence in a self-published fashion whenever they want. But it's interesting because these supply lines going from Poland into Ukraine are really the creation of the U.S. I mean, the U.S. are the ones that are running this airport. That's kind of like Ramstein 2.0. Ramstein is it's the U.S. military base in Germany, air base, and they've put like a mini version of that in southeastern Poland, like just maybe 60 miles or so from the border. And all day long, there are these jets flying in under the NATO aegis into this airport, and the U.S. runs this facility. I mean, they set up inside. This is where Biden visited a couple of days ago, and when he was having some kind of colloquy with the troops and said, "Oh, maybe you're going to go into Ukraine." I mean, I'm paraphrasing.
I think we have that clip. I just want to play it because I first saw it when you tweeted it out, and I do think it's worth listening to if we can pull that up.
Ukrainian people have a lot of backbone. They have a lot of guts, and I'm sure you're observing it. And I don't mean just the military, which is we've been trained in since back when Russia moved into in the southeast Ukraine, but also the average citizen. Look at how they're stepping up. Look at how they're stepping up. And you're going to see when you're there, and some of you have been there, you're going to see women, young people standing in the middle in front of a damn tank, just saying, "I'm not leaving. I'm holding my ground." They're incredible, but they take a lot of inspiration from us. And woman who just died, the Secretary of State, used to have an expression. She said, "We are the essential nation."
Take a lot of inspiration from us?
Sounds like a bit of a hyperbole, but the truth of the matter is, you are the organizing principle around which the rest of the world the free world is moving.
The fuck's he talking about,
Cracker? So what do you think was going on there, Michael?
Joe?
Did he just slip up? Because there were some major implications to what he said there. Or does he know something that we don't know?
Well, what does "you're going to see when you're there" mean? I mean, unless we're just assuming that he's totally mentally incompetent, in which case he should either be removed from office using the 25th Amendment, or it should be demanded he resign. Remember, there was always these calls for Trump to resign because he was supposedly mentally incapacitated, or maybe incapacitated by his collusive relationship with Russia. But if Biden is constantly making these incredibly fraught statements a couple of miles from where bombs are dropping, and where he's saying that U.S. military deployments to Ukraine could precipitate World War III, and he's saying that there's a plan of some kind, where he's appearing to allude to the existence of a plan to deploy U.S. troops, boots on the ground, into Ukraine. What are we to
I think they're going to slip Biden out at some point. They're just going to move him on.
I don't know what the situation is. Maybe
make him disappear.
He screwed up, and he's just screwing up. I don't know, 12 times a day.
Including with the Putin can't remain in power.
Right, which
I don't came back to back.
Oops, Grandpa fell out the back door. I guess he left out the door, and we don't know where he is anymore. We'll just replace him. Move on.
Nuclear weapons are all
look out. Look, the person that they're going to replace is going to be scary as shit. Guarantee it.
Existential threat against Russia. I think I'm summarizing that correctly in terms of their nuclear posture. And what is an existential threat to Russia if not the U.S. president going to Poland and demanding that the president of Russia be forcibly removed from power, or at least appearing to call for that pretty explicitly?
Well, even before he made that statement, all throughout his speech, he was saying, "We stand with the Russian people." He was giving the kind of message to the segment of the population that they would like to see overthrow Putin, that the U.S. stands with them. It's very clear, even though he didn't explicitly state it to the end, that was a core message in the speech.
Yeah, I mean, so we our enemies are not the Russian people, but we're inflicting the most suffering we possibly can on you through sanctions and trying to kill your brothers and fathers on the battlefield with these weapons transfers, and by the way, trying to overthrow your government. But you're not enemies. That's the logic, right? So I don't know if Biden screwed up when he said that. And that was at this airport in Yeshiv. where Biden was making this appearance. And that's one of these places where you can't get any media access to. Not even the hand-picked kind of sycophantic journalists can get media access to these places. So we only can rely on government press releases and kind of Pentagon say so to have any sense of what is going on at these facilities. And that's perfectly fine with a number of journalists. I mean, I've been having these constant exchanges with this Reuters journalist, Jerry something. I mean, I block his name out of my head because he's just such a doofus. But he's saying, oh, look, why would you bother to go to report on any of this? The Pentagon themselves are putting out
Michael Tracy
press releases where they explain what U.S.
I do like Michael Tracy. He does good stuff. I'm not gonna say his personal opinions can get a little jaded and a little long-winded, but his journalism is good, and he has a humor. I like him. It's funny.
Like a few sentences of an explanation of what the U.S. troops are doing in this region. And if Biden is saying, is at least appearing to say that there's this troop deployment coming, or maybe in the works, or has already happened, who knows? The point is, we can't get any independent corroboration of much of anything because of this intensive and deliberate imposition of secrecy that journalists don't seem to care about, because they're just rooting for the glorious triumph of Ukraine, which I guess is their right, but they shouldn't lecture others who maybe want a bit more of an empirical assessment of like what the nature of this war effort really is.
How were U.S. soldiers received in Poland? You write about how they interacted with the public there, and you already have mentioned that a lot of the public in Poland is very, you could say, pro-U.S. intervention in Ukraine. But what did you see, or what did you hear from them?
Well, what they told me, I mean, what a unit of soldiers who I talked to pretty extensively all unanimously told me is that they are viewed overwhelmingly favorably. I don't think there's any use obscuring that. I mean, I think the Polish people, by and large, are happy with them there and want them there. And it sort of serves a dual purpose, because while a lot of Poles have this desire to be more assertive against Russia and to, maybe even fight Russia and Ukraine or what have you, they're still apprehensive about the Polish military itself doing that. And they'd much rather the U.S. just do it on their behalf, right? Of course, which is not surprising, because the U.S. basically runs NATO, and Poland's a member of NATO, but they have just overwhelmingly dwarfed in terms of resources by the U.S. Right? So they have a very friendly attitude toward U.S. Soldiers in their country, even though it's kind of creepy and dystopian, because you go to Krakow, which is ordinarily a very placid city, and the mission apparently of U.S. troops is just stride around and
and eat pierogies, you said, which are no longer considered Russian.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I saw when I was in Krakow in particular, and I think this is also the case in places in Warsaw, is that there was a type of pierogi that's the Russian pierogi. Right? It's cheese and potato or something. And in this tourist district, all the restaurants, crossed out Russian on the menu list and scribbled in Ukrainian, because they have their own little version of like a freedom fries thing happening now, where anything Russian related must be squelched. So it's kind of gives you a little bit of insight into the nature of the paranoia. Again, I don't want to come across as wholly dismissive of Polish anxieties, but there is definitely an element of it that is slightly paranoid and maybe even cavalier, as evidenced by their constant attempts to goad the U.S. into taking brazen military action on their behalf.
Well, another perspective you got while in Poland was that of Ukrainian refugees. I think the numbers you cite are that there are around 2 million who have fled to Poland, which is a 6% increase in the country's population. I was looking at your piece titled, "Unfortunately, Displaced Ukrainians Are Calling for World War III." And you do a really good job, I think, of just treating these people like humans. Some people might react really aggressively if they heard someone call for a no-fly zone in Ukraine, even if there's someone who recently fled the country. But you kind of just let people speak. And then I wanted to highlight this one segment that you write. You say, the sentiment of wishing for a no-fly zone, it's a totally understandable sentiment. She believes, speaking of one of the refugees you met, that closing the sky will save the male relatives left behind, end the war, and enable her to return home. But she had little concept of what a no-fly zone really is, how it would be executed, or even that it would involve military action. And that's not her fault at all. She's just gone through a harrowing 3 weeks. Anyone who's forced to flee their home and traverse a war zone would justifiably be more preoccupied with their own family's welfare than the details of theoretical military strategy. And you essentially place the blame at Zelensky for making Ukrainians believe that this is actually the way for peace, to actively call for World War III. What more can you tell us about your experience interacting with Ukrainian refugees?
Yeah, with the exception of one woman, and they are almost entirely women that I spoke to, because men are conscripted in Ukraine. So, save for some older men and for some young male children. There really aren't that many men to talk to who have fled Ukraine. So by and large, it was women who I spoke to, many of whom had children that they brought with them into Poland, and they took harrowing journeys in many cases with their neighborhoods being bombed and jets flying over their houses constantly. And these are just ordinary people who would have liked to just stay where they were at in Ukraine, but in the case of one woman who I spoke to, she only left when she felt like she was no longer confident in the safety of her baby. So I mean, I don't know, you can't begrudge somebody that at all. But when you talk to them about what they would like to see done on a military basis, or at least some sort of intervention to bring an end to the war, they're almost universally, with the exception of one person that I spoke to, in favor of a no-fly zone. And they don't even use the term no-fly zone. They say close the sky. And close the sky is this sort of euphemism on top of a euphemism that's been popularized by Zelensky and by Ukrainian government officials. They say close the sky because it almost sounds benign, right? It sounds humanitarian. Just close up the sky.
Paul, you missed the open of my show.
No more bombs will fall.
I started out with some
an ordinary Ukrainian,
stuff you'd like.
Especially somebody who's
you get a chance to check it out later.
Extremely, upending experience of fleeing their home, which might have been destroyed, or their livelihood is lost, and they have now relatives actively fighting. They're not going to be in the weeds of the details of what closing the sky actually entails. They're just told that closing the sky is what is required to stop the war. And so it kind of just doubles in the popular nomenclature I found, also amongst Poles themselves. Close the sky is just sort of a generic expression of desire to end the war, because there's a deliberate obfuscation going on about what closing the sky means. Like a lot of people I spoke to, including refugees, don't even really have any cognizance that it's a military operation at all. I don't know what they think it is. It's just kind of a generic slogan that's been instilled in them. And again, they're not at fault for that. I mean, they are ultimately victims who have been displaced. So you can't render harsh moral judgment on them. But I think a harsh moral judgment ought to be rendered on government officials such as Zelensky, who's been valorized now as this international savior figure for in a sense, deceiving his population by saying that they're going to be.
So for late joiners, this is Michael Tracy, currently in Poland, was just in the Ukraine. He was just there, currently in Poland, reporting from Poland. And
but there's a kind of a narrow.
Of course, the gray zone
where
they do themselves pretty good stuff.
But especially in the case of Zelensky, who has this kind of bubble or an aura of heroism and courage around him that's been attributed to him by all these Western audiences that have lavished him with such praise. I think the implications of what he's demanding ought to be called out for what they are, which is that he wants World War III. He's a chief lobbyist for World War III, and he's trying to rally his citizens, his now diaspora, to lend emotional credence to his demands. And he's doing that by obfuscating what it is he's really calling for. And they often use the rhetoric that now you even see sort of imported into American domestic political debates. Like Mike Quigley, who's a Democratic congressman from Illinois, also articulated this theory in the House of Representatives, I think around 2 weeks ago now, which is that they believe that the World War III is already upon us. So you hear a lot of Ukrainian refugees saying this, some Poles saying this, and even now a couple of Americans, including politicians, national politicians, saying that it's not a matter of whether we start World War III or don't we. It's a matter of recognizing that World War III is underway and deciding when the U.S. is going to strike back.
That we need to get in on it as soon as possible, even more than we already are doing it.
Because the longer we wait, the stronger Putin can potentially get, and the more of an upper hand he'll have on us. Because there's no question any longer that we're going to be at war with Russia. So that's what Mike Quigley, Democratic congressman from Illinois, said earlier this month, and you see that kind of also echoed by a lot of ordinary refugees, unfortunately. And so I think it requires a bit of a kind of careful moral reasoning to kind of land on what the appropriate response is to that when you hear it from somebody who has genuinely been victimized.
Yeah, and speaking of the closing the sky phrase that has come to replace the no-fly zone demand, I wanted to play a clip filmed by Ford Fisher yesterday in DC, where there was a rally, which he says hundreds of Ukrainian migrants, or I would say expats, probably people who didn't necessarily just flee the war, but people who have been here for a while, rallied in order to call for the closing of the sky. And I wanted to play for viewers a video that was broadcast during that demonstration.
If you don't close the sky, I will die. If you don't close the sky, Mom will cry if you don't glow the sky. He'll lose home if you don't glow the sky. They'll be doomed if you don't glow the sky. The sky will still fight if you don't glow the sky. Will fail the night if you don't glow the sky. He might win. Now look in his eyes and sink again.
I would like to invite to the stage Bill Crystal, who is the founding director of Defending Democracy Together.
And now let's turn it over to Bill Crystal.
That to me just summarized that video was haunting, very disturbing.
Do you know who the musical artist was, by the way? I'm sort of curious.
No idea. No, I would like to find out. But it's obviously very manipulative propaganda. And the fact that it immediately turns from feel really bad for these children, take this action to help them. Now let's
cringe,
speak to one of the major
That was so
architects of the
bad.
the most pro-war
What the
and
fuck was that?
Of
Oh
his
my
generation,
God.
Bill Crystal. I just thought that encapsulated.
All right, I'm ready to work out. What
the
the
tension
fuck
of
was
the
that?
closest
That was
guy
so
narrative and what they're really
cringe. I
calling
need to go
for
burn off
so
some
well.
energy.
Bill Crystal, pioneer of regime change as like the operative guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy in the 90s, famously wrote a manifesto with Robert Kagan, where he even had the gumption to call for regime change in Beijing. So
Robert Kagan, the wife of Victoria Nuland,
Right.
currently overseeing Biden-Ukraine policy.
I think one thing to
Or
note,
the husband, I should say, yeah.
There's as much as the people who are displaced from Ukraine are owed sympathy and genuinely ought to be granted sympathy, it still is the case that there's been a huge outpouring of resources to help them. I traveled from Poland to Brussels because I attempted to go to the NATO summit this past week, but was rejected by apparently the Belgian Ministry of Defense. But at the train station in Brussels, there's a whole kiosk available for Ukraine refugees to go and get information about jobs, and they can stay in the European Union, I think now for up to at least a year without even having to submit any paperwork. They're getting, all kinds of charity assistance, governmental assistance. In Poland, if you go to the ATM, you're immediately presented with an option to donate to one of the officially designated aid organizations.
This is something you show in your article. You actually show a picture of the ATM screen and where it gives you options, check your balance, your savings. There's also just a Ukrainian flag and it's like donate here.
So there's an enormous outpouring of assistance to these displaced people, to the point where now I think it's justified to question how that money is being spent and what actors the money is actually being funneled to. Because in another Substack, for example, I recount an encounter I had with a gentleman who I happened to hear yapping on the phone loudly in Rzeszów, and he was bragging with one of his colleagues about how connected he is to special forces, how he's trying to get air cargo lifted into Ukraine from Canada somehow. I went and tried to interview him. He wouldn't give me his name or affiliations. I don't know who the guy is, and I'm not stating anything as fact as what he told me. I'm just relaying what I happened to experience, and I knew that a very intense familiarity with the Department of Defense procurement process, and had a lot of intensive knowledge about the supply lines coming in and out of Poland into Ukraine. And he told me, and despite his additional claim that he had a direct line to the Ukrainian military's general staff, he claimed that he was just involved in humanitarian aid.
Oh, right.
Even though I also heard him saying that
So
he's
I
trying
want
to
to take a hit for that follow, but I was trying to look and find it.
There's a lot of people who can.
I guess whoever it was tried to follow me real quick, make a comment, and bolted, and their comment was fucking hit by the moderator.
But given
no hit for that kind of follow,
I think there is a genuine need to deploy humanitarian resources. They're able to kind of finagle into this whole kind of financial network now that's been established and use it for their own designs.
And this is something that goes back even to the Contra War, when Elliot Abrams oversaw the shipment of weapons to the Contras under the guise of humanitarian aid. Again, in Venezuela.
Also 2019, 2019 in Venezuela, that was the same cover story.
And
right?
in Syria as well, a lot of
the
aspects of the dirty war were conducted under the auspice of providing humanitarian aid. And you have all of these shady characters, likely people with, or usually people with former military and intelligence training, who are now private contractors who kind of act as the go-between. And that's exactly, I think, what you were getting at. That's what's happening in Poland. And we're not allowed to find out anything about it. You're really the one who's come closest to cracking any of that. So I wonder when we'll ever get the true information out. But Michael, what about your experience trying to cover NATO? I was going to ask you about that as well.
Yeah, so there was an extraordinary summit announced, like 2 weeks ago now or something. And who decides when a summit is extraordinary at NATO? I'm not sure. It seems like a way to puff themselves up and inflate their self-importance. But I went through because I just wanted to test out and see what would happen if I went through the ordinary accreditation process at NATO. So I write for this outlet called Unheard. It's this UK media organization, and I had them write out a formal letter of editorial authorization to me to submit to NATO, along with my passport information and all that. And I got an email a couple of days later, the following Monday. So the summit was this past Thursday, and then I got an email the previous Monday saying, "I'm sorry, due to space limitations, we simply cannot accommodate you." Now, bear in mind, NATO just opened up a brand spanking new headquarters in Brussels in 2018. That is something like 2.4 million square feet, which the U.S. largely underwrote because the U.S. pays for most of what goes on with NATO. And they're saying that they just have they don't have enough physical room to allow me in. And I'm not like making myself out to be a martyr or anything. I'm just noting that there's a filter for who's allowed to attend these functions. And so you only have the BBC and CNN and NBC and ABC, such that one of the big questions posed to Biden at the press conference, that I was of course excluded from, was by this woman Cecilia Vega, reporter at ABC News, where she asked Biden, her big criticism and her big pretension to being an adversarial journalist holding power to account was to ask Biden if he was perhaps too quick to rule out starting World War III. That's what Cecilia Vega of ABC News asked Joe Biden. So the type of person who automatically gets press accreditation.
Those are the tough questions you're allowed to ask.
Those are the very tough questions that really keep the politicians on their toes, that you're allowed to officially ask. Whereas, I wasn't able to get in. And, even though I had gotten this email telling me I wasn't allowed to get in, sometimes, as you're aware, if you show up in person to events or whatever, you can kind of figure out a way to get in, or you can talk to somebody or whatever, an arrangement can be made. So I thought that was potentially possible. I was going to go to Brussels anyway, because I was sort of en route to where I am now in England. And, so I went, and you're directed to go to the old NATO. The Press Accreditation Center is at the old NATO headquarters prior to the one that opened up in 2018. It was now in this building that has now been returned to the Belgian Ministry of Defense. So by the way, why does Belgium need a Ministry of Defense at this point? I'm not sure. But anyway, it exists. I mean, it's a physical place that I now have observed myself. And you go and talk to these soldiers, Belgian soldiers, and they're the ones who handle whether you get a press access or not. And so one of the Belgian soldiers who I talked to, made a phone call to somebody unknown at NATO. He wouldn't tell me who he called, but he made a phone call to somebody who confirmed to him that I was rejected for admission to the summit and that I had to leave the premises.
5-6 minutes here is the best part.
So
and then we'll
I'm not
move
going to
on,
get into it.
I got to do the last.
If you had one question.
Well, I would have asked him, does he admit that the U.S. is fueling a proxy war in Ukraine? Does he admit that the U.S. is waging a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine? I think because, the actual policy of what the U.S. is currently doing has just not been explicitly enough laid out. And this is not like a conspiratorial or extreme view. Leon Panetta, it's interesting because, Media Matters, they follow me very closely now because they're, holding power to account by looking at my Twitter feed. And because I was on Tucker's show, they said that I'm a conservative journalist and I'm repeating Russian talking points because I characterized the U.S. war effort as a proxy war. So to say that the U.S. is engaging in proxy warfare in Ukraine is now a conservative talking point or a Russian talking point. Lo and behold, Leon Panetta, just a few days before, had been on Bloomberg and himself said that the U.S. is waging a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. And he was proud of it. He was saying that that's what ought to be done. He was touting the policy. So I wrote to Media Matters and said, do you plan to run an article accusing Leon Panetta, who was the Secretary of Defense and CIA director under Barack Obama in the Obama-Biden administration? Do you plan to accuse him of being a despicable conservative and or a purveyor of Russian talking points? And crazily enough, I haven't received a reply back.
Shocking.
But anyway, I would have asked Biden, it's a simple question, but I would have asked him to just admit, I wanted to hear him in his own words address the question of whether this is a proxy war, because I think that would heighten kind of the resonance for ordinary Americans who just, if they're talking to a pollster, say that they support standing with Ukraine. Well, what does standing with Ukraine mean? It actually has a policy implication. And the policy implication is that we're engaged in a proxy war. And it's not even just the weapons transferring aspect. I mean, just before I left for Poland on March 3rd, there was this controversy where this there was like a mini controversy where the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the House, Adam Smith, Democratic congressman from Washington State, was on Morning Joe. So went on Morning Joe in the morning and said, no, of course, it would be a step too far for the U.S. to actively share intelligence with the Ukraine military for use in combat operations. That would run up too precariously close to actual hot war with Russia. So we're not doing that. That's what Adam Smith said in the morning. Then a couple hours later, Jen Psaki basically confirms that the U.S. is doing exactly that. That the U.S. is doing exactly what Adam Smith, the congressman, a few hours earlier had said would be some sort of red line in escalating tensions with Russia. And so that's another facet of this proxy warfare. Not just the dumping of more weapons than have been dumped into Europe since the 1940s, which is another remarkable stat that I don't see emphasized enough. But also active coordination in the military logistics of the Ukrainian warfighting. So, I mean, is the president who oversees this policy, presumably, assuming that he has any level of competence, which I guess is an open question in terms of his mental state, but is he willing to just acknowledge reality and say that this is proxy warfare? Because if he is, that might be helpful in generating slightly more debate than has been as yet allowed. Because as we mentioned earlier, there's been this crystallization of totally intractable consensus around this issue, in part because I think the terms of the debate have not been spelled out yet. I mean, I think if you ask Americans, do you think proxy warfare against Russia is good or bad, or do you support it or oppose it, you might see a little bit more of a split in public opinion than if you just ask them, ought we to stand with Ukraine, which could mean anything from just putting an emoji in your Twitter display name to waving a flag to a no-fly zone. So yeah, that's what I probably would have asked Biden. I don't know. What would you have asked him?
No, I think it's similar. Just, can anyone deny that sending weapons to Ukraine is just prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainian people at that point? How can you claim to be standing with the people of Ukraine if you're actively inflaming a hot war situation? No, I think the question of whether or not he would admit to a proxy war, and even if you brought up the quote of Leon Panetta, that would be pretty damning, I think. I wanted to ask,
Leon, he's a good friend of mine, but and they just fall asleep.
The thing. You actually also met an American, a U.S. citizen who traveled to Ukraine he was training at this interestingly named International Center for Peacekeeping and Security, which was
a lot of weapons at this peacekeeping center, oddly enough.
You met an individual named Xander. I just couldn't believe you were writing about how he was watching Saving Private Ryan on this base when the Russian military actually bombed it, sent a very clear message that it was not going to tolerate any potential NATO training or escalation in Ukraine. What did this interaction with, I believe his name was Xander, tell you about what was going on there?
Well, yeah, he's one of these guys who has joined this International Legion. I think he called it the Zelensky Battalion in Ukraine, where to fight Russia, which is just totally bizarre. But Zelensky himself has encouraged this and tried to invite more and more American, foreign, mostly young men who have this adventurous spirit to flock into Ukraine and take up arms. And as you're showing on the screen now, before he left, he actually got that tattoo in New York, bizarrely enough. But he got a tattoo of like the Ukrainian military insignia on his palm, or not palm.
Who is he? What? Why did he want to do that? Is it just
he's
a media here?
He's a guy who it's sort of interesting. I didn't get this into the piece because I just did a little tidbit on him, but I don't want to go into that much detail.
I'm just trying to understand the mind of someone.
It's a very odd mind, but he's a smart guy. He has a lot of theories about the ideological dimensions of what's transpiring in Ukraine. He was a graduate student who was studying at a European university and thought that this would advance his studies to get a firsthand look at the ideological factions that are waging war right now in Ukraine, which I guess entailed him also waging war himself. Wow. But the information that I thought was most telling, which is when I wrote about it in the Substack, is that when Russia bombed this international peacekeeping facility in far western Ukraine, just about 15 miles from the Polish border, was kind of a wake-up call for people both in Poland and also in the U.S. saying, look, this is coming extremely close to the borders of NATO, which we keep saying is the ultimate red line. So if that border is transgressed at all by Russia, all bets are off, and we're invoking our collective defense obligation or whatnot. And then World War III is probably a given. So Russia bombs this facility, and the Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby is asked about it the following day, and Kirby denies that any Americans were casualties in this bombing. they had a local kind of Ukrainian government official give a very vague assessment of who was actually killed in the bombing, something like 33 or 35 sort of supposedly killed, and then many more injured. And Kirby, the Pentagon spokesperson, said that no Americans were injured. And, there were no American casualties. And that wasn't true, according to what this gentleman, Vander, told me. And I just, this is not a troll trying to trick me. This is something that happened across at a large processing center for displaced Ukrainians right across the border in Poland.
Absolutely crazy.
Where he just happened to be one day. And he said that he was
absolutely crazy. Well, there was a real reporter for you. Boots on the ground. That's what we look for, right? So Michael Tracy was just there. He's reporting on it. That would be what we call boots on the ground. Somebody who was there, who did the actual journalism reporting. This one was sent to me by a trusted source, good friend. So, friend of the show, I guess you call it. So I'm going to go ahead and play it blind. We're going to trust this person. I know Kyle Kalinske. I don't like the guy anymore, but he's not going to... He has been disappeared, though, so I think he's been muted on Twitter recently. Is that what he is?
Story is really something else, man. For people who think, well, Trump is definitely dead and gone, he's not going to make a political comeback. Look, there are warning signs that he'll self-destruct. Can't stop talking about rigged election. But there's some indicators that he's more alive and ready than ever before. So take a look at this here from Ken Vogel. Cash on hand. This is as of February 28th. Trump, $110.4 million. DNC, $52.9 million. RNC, $45.5 million. So let me explain what that means. Trump's Save America PAC, this is PAC money we're talking about here. Trump's Save America PAC has more money on hand than Democrats and Republicans combined. That is stunning. This guy has a total and complete lockdown on his base. Not only that, the other thing is Trump still can raise big money from big donors and corporations. That's not good for any of us. He's going to be a force based on this alone, dog. Based on this alone, he's going to be a force. He is. You got to keep it real. Now, of course, the other thing is, remember when Trump used to pretend, I self-funded my entire campaign? Really? So what's this? Is that $110.4 million of your own money? No. It's not. Of course it's not. I mean, the real thing, nobody should take any super PAC money, for example, and really the best way, the most ethical way to run for office is to only take small dollar donations. Obviously, Trump does not do that. Sometimes he pretends like this is what he does. But if he has this much money now, that's also an indicator he will continue to raise a tremendous amount of money. And for him to have more than both parties combined. In politics, money is power. It's true. And it is true for presidential races. It's slightly different because there's so much coverage of all the different candidates, so much national news coverage. So the money difference is less than in congressional races and Senate races and local elections. Like the money doesn't matter as much in a presidential race versus those other races, but it still matters a lot, man. And that money means you could build infrastructure on the ground, means you can run ads in your favor and against your opponents, means you can buy allegiances. You can shuffle some of that money to other candidates who you support. You could build a giant network, like a Trump network of political players. It is a massive red flag. And it's almost, when you look at like how sheepish and meek the other Republicans have been in distancing themselves from Trump, it's going to come back to bite him in the ass, man. I get Mitch McConnell and a bunch of the others are like, well, let's not talk about the last election. Let's move forward. But it's like, nobody cares what Mitch McConnell says anyway in the country. And they're always the meekest denunciations of all time. Like Mike Pence did it recently. We got to look forward, not backward. It's wrong that I could have overturned the election. I can't. And then he just moves on. And it's like, well, this guy's crusading around the country, screaming the opposite from the top of his lungs to packed rallies and you're like sheepishly saying it in front of a tiny room of elite donors in DC. I don't think they realize the potential this guy still has. Again, I'll caution, he can self-destruct. He can't stop talking about the...
His pact's not also just for himself. His pact is to try to push fucking people like in Congress that are like fanatics like him, and his pact will push those people hard. And to push those people hard, you have to have double what the Senate race of the other person is. So you have to have, $8 to $10 million Senate races or Congress races. So they need that much to push 4 or 5 candidates. And Trump rallies run themselves. His base is already fucking eccentric can be. It's like it's a sports team fanatic team. Like you can't change them at this point. So who cares? I'm done trying to fight on that shit. Speaking of that, one more Trump clip.
Stop
This is also
scrolling. I need your help.
sent
Trump
to
and
me
his
by
Republicans
somebody.
are determined to do anything they can to
Oh, shut up and just
Former
disappear.
President Donald Trump is available. He's on the phone and he joins us now. Mr. President, thanks very much for being on the show this morning.
Hello, Stuart.
I understand that over the weekend at a rally in Florida, you said that it was your personality that stopped Putin invading during your presidency. You want to explain that?
Well, that's very interesting. We start off with that one because if you remember when I was running in 2016, they all said Trump will get us into a war.
Right.
It's his personality. He's going to get us. And actually, now they say it was my personality that kept us out of a war. So I think it was, we had a great 4 years, and it shouldn't have happened what happened, but it did with the election, and now we have people running it. What's gone on with Ukraine should never have happened,
Well,
Stuart.
President Biden goes to Poland on Friday of this week. Frontline NATO state. What should he do?
Well, it's very late. The cards are laid and the cards are out, and he's got a bad hand. He's given himself a very bad hand. He had a very strong hand before it all started, the strongest. And it should have never started. It would have never, ever started if I were president. I can tell you that with 100% certainty. This is horrible. This is a human tragedy, what's going on. He's now going with a very weak hand, and he is not somebody that really mixes it up. He sits there, and everyone tells him what to do and what they're doing, and he doesn't mix it up. He doesn't. He does. Look, it's very sad to watch. I've watched it. I've seen it. And these other countries are taking over, they're leading, and we're supposed to be the one that's leading, and they're taking advantage of us like they have. Even our allies, they take advantage of us on NATO, they take advantage of us on just about everything they can, and in particular on trade. I mean, on top of everything else, they take advantage of us on trade, and they're really telling him what they want to do, not what we want to do. So it's pretty sad to watch.
There's this discussion about whether we should send jets, MiG jets, to help the Ukrainian Air Force. Would you send in that kind of help?
Well, maybe even more.
This guy is hard
to
to listen to. Oh my God, he's getting worse.
I'm the one that would have stayed out.
Him and Sleepy Joe are both slipping.
Putin is saying things like, "Don't you dare send anything in." In the meantime, he's killing thousands and thousands of people. So he's acting like we're an aggressor. If we send in some old 44-year-old plane that probably gets shot out of the sky pretty quickly, and he's acting like we're terrible people if we do that. But he's killing tens of thousands of people, far more than they're reporting. You don't knock down those buildings and blow up those buildings, and they say 2 people were injured slightly. And thousands of people are being killed. And when he says, "Don't you dare do that," and we all say, "Oh, he said don't do it," we don't want to start. The fact is that what he's doing is a human tragedy. There's not been anything like this, in a sense, maybe ever, but certainly since World War II when you look at it. But there's never been anything like this.
So what do you do now? You said you'd maybe do more than just send in the MiG jets. All right. What more?
What I would do is we have tremendous military capability. And what we can do without planes, to be honest with you, without 44-year-old
I don't know if I can handle this. Somebody sent it to me. I was going to give it a Trump on Trump thing, but
and we should be
fucking brutal.
helping them to survive. And they're doing an amazing job. But, I was the one that did the javelin.
He's losing his shit.
Refuses acknowledge that, and I took a
He
lot
was
of
rough
heat.
at the end, man,
And
but he is.
I sent it in very
Cognitive decline is a
openly
thing.
and glowingly,
We just have
and
to
they
accept
said
it.
Obama said
75-year-olds aren't meant
blankets
to
and
run the
Trump said
country.
javelins. Well,
75-year-olds aren't meant
nobody
to
knew how well
be on
those
top of their
javelins
game.
would
They're
do and
75
how
years
well they.
old.
But those
Your peak
javelins
is
that
from
knocked
like
out all the
15
tanks,
to,
those
I
were
don't know,
sent by me,
55.
and we sent them
After
in
that,
large
there's a little bit
numbers
of cognitive
too.
decline,
I didn't
but
even realize at the
experience,
time when I sent
the
them. I said,
experience
man,
to cognitive
you know,
decline
that's a lot of
ratio in
stuff
your
we're
50s
sending,
and
but let's
60s
do
is
it.
supposed
Let
to be
them
somewhere,
have a chance.
and
I
then
had,
it,
who
you
would
know,
have thought
it
that they would have
unbalances
been
at some point.
so powerful the way they protected that country? But
This guy
they
is
need
just done,
other
man.
kinds
I'm
of
done
help.
with him.
And one thing I do rapidly is that get the oil.
Oh, you'd get that oil, wouldn't you? You'd get that oil. I guarantee you'd get that oil. That's what he would do. He'd get that oil. Fucking Trump. All right. So I'm going to turn them back up. So this was the Ballot Initiatives panel. I am all for third parties and a ballot initiative. So let's, have the conversation. I had a few segments, just couple clips out of this one. Let's just be quick about it. It's a lot of panels on the weekends, and I don't want to sit here and play 6 hours of panels. If I was an 8-hour streamer, maybe I'd do that, but I'm a 2 to 3 hour streamer. I just want to get through the news, make it so it's chill, but I get a lot of clips, and you guys can just blaze and relax, which the few people that usually do is what they do. I love the chatters too. If you want to chat it up, let me know. We can have a whole conversation. If you want to hear me rant about my politics every freaking week, people are like, what kind of politics are you? My name's Stoney Progressive. I'm probably a progressive. Not a Democratic progressive. More of a far left progressive, I guess. All right. So this was the ballot initiatives panel. From left to right, you have Sabby Sabs or Sabrina Salvani, Gavin of the Vanguard. You have Kira McCone of Hardlands Media. You have Unholy Rome from Revolutionary Blackout Network. You have Compton J or CJ from Revolutionary Blackout Network. You have Meg McPherson or Meg Killjoy, and Ron Placone of Ron Placone Get Your News On with Ron. He used to be with Jimmy Dore. So pretty awesome panel. And I got 3 different clips I'm going to jump around to. I'm not trying to play favorites. I just, some people were like, oh, yep, that person and that person did good. That person did good. La-da-da. These 3 segments were pretty key. And they make me go on the 6 seconds here on Rockfin, so it's not going to be exact.
Feels like they've been deserted by the two-party system, like yours truly. Ballot initiatives are a really great way, like a great route to go. So basically how it works, our citizens will gather a certain amount of signatures. It's all different based on your state, based on your population, all the rules. You can check out what your state does at ballotpedia.org, which is literally where I've gotten so much of my information in regards to ballot initiatives for 2022. They are really thorough, and it's really incredible to have that tool at our fingertips. But you get your signatures, right? And then once those signatures are passed, basically by probably the Secretary of State, but again, it differs from state to state, then it ends up on the ballot for that year's elections. So this year, it's not a presidential election, and strategically, a lot of times people won't put ballot initiatives up on presidential election years because the turnout isn't as big. But the research that I've been doing over the past several months is showing me that there are many initiatives that are a possibility right now in several states. So if you find that your state is a ballot initiative state, I invite you to start taking steps to getting involved with that. So that's ballot initiative.
All right, I'm going to play a few minutes here, so
some
stick
of the
with
things
us.
we've passed in Massachusetts through ballot initiatives is, of course, the most popular one is legalizing marijuana. A lot of people on the East Coast were really excited when that happened and all of a sudden wanted to come visit me. So that was really interesting. We've also passed the Right to Repair Act, which that only applies to automobiles, but that was a huge win here. And unfortunately, ranked choice voting was on the ballot in 2020 and that did not pass. And that's because most people I spoke to said they didn't understand the question. And sometimes I think that's done on purpose. I'll be honest with you. but I'm going to share my screen and I want to show you exactly what this looks like in the states that are BI states. And shout out to Roger Meadows, because this is all him, by the way. He sent me this information. He's educated me a lot about ballot initiatives, and he's been asking me to do this panel for a while. So there's two different statutes. One is indirect and one is direct. Indirect is proposed by citizens through initiative petitions. It does not go immediately on the ballot after a successful petition drive. But in this case, you have to collect signatures, which is what Kira was just telling you about. The law that the citizens are proposing must first be submitted to state legislature for consideration. If the state legislature does not agree to adopt the law, then it automatically goes to the ballot for voters to vote on. And the other statute is direct initiative. And this is when proposed amendments by citizens through an initiative goes immediately to the ballot after a successful petition drive. So there are 24 states that are BI states. Alaska, Maine, and Wyoming are indirect BI for state law only. And Mississippi is indirect for state constitutional amendment only. They should pass an amendment that would allow them to pass state law, but do it through direct ballot initiatives. That's something Roger was suggesting. I'm in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is indirect for both state law and for constitutional. And then Idaho is a direct BI state for state law. Florida and Illinois are direct BI for state constitutional amendments only. So that's important to note. And then direct BIs for both Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Oklahoma, Oregon. And then indirect ballot initiative for state law, but direct for state constitutional amendment. Those states are Michigan, Ohio, and Nevada. And you have Utah and Washington that are direct and indirect for BI for state law only. I'm going to pass to the panel, but one thing I do want to add, because I know this question is going to come up. What about states that are not on that list, right? That don't have ballot initiatives? The idea is that when BI states pass legislation, it puts pressure on the surrounding states to implement the same procedure. So for example, when we legalized marijuana in Massachusetts, that put pressure on New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Connecticut, and so forth. But I'm going to start with
fighting against Prop 22 around that time, because I used to work for the people that do the ballots and whatnot.
This is Rome, unholy Rome.
And we tried to get marijuana legalized. That failed. But it cost so much money. It cost them so much money just to even pay me, because I'm getting like $7 a singer. So if they got like 100 people under their camp, and the next station got 200 people under their camp, think about how much money is actually being put into this stuff. So, money is a problem. But the thing is, these initiatives speak to many people, so you never know who you are talking to or coming across. And they might have something up under them and be like, you know what? I was going to spend this on Las Vegas. Here you go. And sometimes you can look up like that, but you got to keep on speaking on it. And in certain areas, grower areas, you're trying to get anything passed as of hemp, because we still got to fight. I think we still got to fight for hemp, for the people to have it, because that's the lumber companies coming after us. That's a big pharma, and who else? The motherfucking sugar. It's so much. It's so many. Even Ford is coming after us for this hemp, because they see if the people get control of this, what we really can do. It really make them afraid of losing money and people just not needing them anymore. But keep pushing on them. You're gonna lose. You're gonna lose at least 3 times. But as long as you got some money behind you, or at least a platform to push what you guys want, you should be able to get enough eyes on it so people can see through the propaganda.
All right, Gavin, I'm gonna go to you next.
Get rid of that. So that's one that I'm seeing this year that I am definitely voting for, because we need to get rid of that commission. That way we can actually have our voices be heard and not have some silly commission that nobody voted for decide, oh no, we're going to change that and we're going to allow it to be stripped away.
Well said. Kira, what about Illinois?
Hey there. Yeah, so this year it looks like we do have one initiative up on the board right now, and that is an initiative that creates the right for collective bargaining. Again, in Illinois, much like Florida, we can only do direct initiatives for constitutional amendments. And so I'm eager to see how this goes. I haven't seen a lot of ads and propaganda around this particular initiative yet. 2 years ago in Illinois, we had a fair tax initiative. I don't think it was called that, but it was basically like a progressive tax initiative, because in the state of Illinois, we can't raise taxes on a higher tax bracket unless we lift the taxes for the lower tax brackets as well. So it's a flat tax in Illinois. And it got on the ballot, which we were very excited about. I work with a organization here in Chicago called the People's Lobby, and we were actively going door to door and making phone calls so that that initiative would pass. And you would not believe the amount of money that, well, you probably would, this panel probably would, that flooded into fighting against this particular initiative. And I was of the mind, like, there's no way folks are going to vote against this. It's just so against the vast majority of people's interests. There's just no way. Lo and behold, it did not pass. So the money is real, and it's probably, shocker, right? The thing that really that is pushing against us most in the state of Illinois, and obviously across the nation. So I'm eager to see how the bargaining and unionizing constitutional amendment goes, and I have a strong feeling that we'll start seeing a lot of those ads again soon.
Yeah. The ones that we have coming up in Massachusetts right now, there's just one. There's a couple potential ones, but this one is income tax for education and transportation amendment. It creates a 4% tax on incomes that exceed $1 million for education and transportation purposes. So that would actually be beneficial here. You guys know I talk about these schools all the time, how they need to fund these schools. So we'll see if that one passes this year. But I do want to go back up to Ron. Oh, no, hold on a second. I want to tell you guys how they work first, because I see some of the questions in the chat. How do you do it? How do you do a ballot initiative? So I'm going to show you really quick. Just going to share my screen. And just keep in mind, this is how it pertains to my state. If you want to see how it works in your state, you'd have to look up your state on Ballotpedia. So basically in Massachusetts, it says citizens may propose initiated state statutes and initiated constitutional amendments. The power of the initiative is indirect in Massachusetts, which means the Massachusetts General Court must consider any successful initiative proposals. Once enough valid signatures are submitted, proposed statutory initiatives are presented to the legislature. Statutes.
The biggest thing with ballot initiatives is that it is so state by state. I mean, like, they were just showing like all the segments of different ways they categorized how ballot initiatives work, and it's very much state by state. So you have to be due diligent, and they set the system up that way so states' rights, but really it's set up to be confusing, and it's set up so that we don't participate, and we can't push things through, and it's set up against us for a reason. It's a reason for the season. So yeah, they had a press briefing today. I always think a press briefing is a great way to go into a Senate takedown. Shit. I forgot to do one last thing. But yeah, we'll do a Senate takedown of Mike Lee. And then, but after the press briefing, yeah. Without Jen.
Today,
No
we are
Jen.
pleased to welcome Shalonda Young and Cecilia Rouse to the briefing room to address your questions on the 2023
No Jen today.
budget. We have just a few announcements before they go into the president's budget. As we disclosed to all of you this morning, the president tested negative as a part of his regular testing cadence. He was last tested Friday as a part of his regular testing rhythm, and additional testing requirements for travel to and from Europe. Moving
Congratulations
forward,
out for him.
he will proceed on his regular testing schedule.
He's so amazing.
And we will continue to update all of you out of an abundance of transparency. And of course, we wish Kareen and Jen speedy recovery. They are currently both following CDC guidance and will be back following a negative test. Jen shared this morning that she's feeling stir crazy and will be back soon.
We miss you,
First,
Jen.
On Judge Jackson. Judge Jackson
Jen.
continued to build support last week after she spent over
I don't
20
miss
hours
Jen.
in marathon
I mean, I like.
confirmation hearings,
It's entertaining.
demonstrating her credentials, intellect, character, grace, and the value of her
She's
deep
entertaining.
experience. She reminded the country of why the president chose her and why she has been endorsed by conservative judges, the Fraternal Order of Police, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, dozens of police chiefs and sheriffs who lead many of the busiest departments in the United States, and 83 former state attorneys general from both parties. Polls keep showing that she has strong backing among the American people, with some indicating that she has the most support of any Supreme Court nominee since John Roberts, who she ties with and whom she shares, and with whom she shares a similar philosophy about judges serving as referees who decide cases based on the law and the facts. She has now met with more than a majority of the Senate and is continuing her engagement with senators today and throughout the week.
Oh, I
Judge
bet
Jackson
she is.
responded to Republicans' request for in-person meetings by promising to sit down with any member who wanted to, and she is honoring that promise. Something else that speaks to the strength of Judge Jackson's qualifications, which a series of Republicans have affirmed make her unquestionably fit to serve on the Supreme Court, and to the strength of her
Unquestionably.
record,
Ooh.
is the multitude of fact checks from the press, from retired judges, and from former prosecutors who have dismantled attacks brought by a small group of GOP senators. The truth is that every single one of the specific senators who joined in these bad faith attacks on her sentencing record with respect to child pornography has voted for numerous Trump-nominated judges who sentenced defendants for the
They're
same
all so
crimes
boring. I'm
in
just gonna do the
same
questions,
fashion,
guy. I'm sorry.
below
I was gonna try to.
guidelines widely considered to be out of
I don't know
date
why I thought I was
across
gonna try
the
to do this whole
judiciary,
thing.
and below what prosecutors.
So boring.
Sure. Director Young, Josh Bose with AP. I want to understand the reserve fund for whatever comes out of negotiations with Congress. You said on the call this morning that talks are ongoing. The budget says of the president's priorities, they include the expanded child tax credit, something that we previously believed was off the table. Can you give us a sense of where negotiations are and what we could expect in terms of how active they are, such that you felt obligated to exclude those priorities from the total?
One, let me start where you ended. They're not excluded. What we didn't do is detail things, so we did not get ahead of negotiations. You probably heard that I spent a little time on Capitol Hill. What we don't do is get ahead of congressional negotiations. We certainly don't negotiate in public. The reserve fund is meant to hold revenues enough for whatever framework comes out of Congress. What we're not doing
Smacking
is
him the
double
fuck
counting
down.
revenues. So the revenues we're holding in the reserve fund
Damn,
are
she's fun,
different.
too.
For example, we're not counting the savings
We're not gonna be
from
doing that
prescription drug
shit.
reform in the deficit
Not doing that
neutral
shit.
reserve fund. That they can use that if they want. We're not counting that for our 23 budget. So one, we're not going to negotiate in public. Two, we need to leave revenues for legislation the president
You're
has
dumb shit,
consistently
yo.
called on Congress to send to his desk. And that is, I think, as clear as I can be.
Sure, but it's been an exhausting month, as we can all attest to, and I imagine that's true for you as well. Have you had any talks or negotiations with regard to this in the last month with members of Congress?
Look, I think a easy way to not get anything done is to negotiate in public. We're not going to do that. The 23 budget, I think, is the responsible thing to do, to hold enough revenues so Congress can use those if it wants to send legislation to the president that reduces the deficit and reduces costs.
Definitely went to the same school as Jen. Don't answer shit by
Thank you so much.
being like, obviously I'm not going to answer that. You know I'm not going to answer that. Why are you even asking?
Talk a little bit more about that. Is it an effort to persuade Senator
I like that school of thought. Just don't answer by being like, you know I'm not going to answer that shit. I'd be an idiot to answer
Let me
that.
remind you, this president sent him a budget. This is his second one. And in both budgets, he has paid for his proposals. This is a classic Joe Biden budget. So just as he did last year, we're putting forward proposals that do two things. Establishes a tax system that's fair, where corporations and the wealthiest pay their fair share, but it has the added benefit of paying for needs of the American people, like reducing child care.
What specific proposals beyond the wealth tax would lower the deficit by $1 trillion over the next decade, as you say?
So one, we're already in the process from last year to this year, reducing the deficit by $1.3 trillion. The proposals in the budget would also bring about another $1 trillion decrease. In addition to the billionaire income tax proposal that we have in the budget, we also believe that we should take the individual rate back to 39.6%, and also bring corporate tax rates back up. Not even quite back up to where they were before the Trump tax cuts.
Steve? Cecilia, you mentioned that the Ukraine invasion is going to have a complicated inflation. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What should Americans expect? Higher gasoline prices, food? What do you think?
So as the president has said, this is an important place for the United States. This is an important moment for democracy. But what we do know is that Putin's invasion of Ukraine will have impacts on both energy prices and food prices. So he has, as the president has said, we can expect that while our sanctions are going to have their focus and most of their impact on the Russian economy, that we can expect that we will see a bit of impact in the United States as well. So the first we're seeing is
our impact will be better, but we're going to get impacted too. Like our impact's going to be best, but their impact's going to be there too.
That said, the president is focused on doing what he can to ensure that those increases are contained.
These guys are weak as shit. Like this White House fucking press staff is just
so that is, he's worked with our partners
oozing confidence, huh?
60 million barrels
we know what we're doing. This is a good thing. Give a thumbs up.
He has other options on the table that he
like the fact we're trying to go to war.
As they come up.
It's a good thing. I promise.
Prices, the U.S., we don't expect a shortage here because we are net exporters, but we are acutely aware of the fact that there are regions in the world that depend heavily on exports of wheat in particular and other grains from the Ukraine and Russia, and we're working with our partners to ensure to minimize the impacts globally.
Thank you.
For Dr. Ross, just following up on what you said, how is the White House preparing to deal with those food shortages, particularly when it comes to wheat in places like Africa, the Middle East, and the developing countries? And should U.S. farmers grow more wheat this year instead of corn and soybeans, given those possible food shortages?
So first of all, we are a net exporter of many of those food commodities, and farmers respond to price signals. And so with the price of food rising, they will be responding by making additional plantings and trying to take advantage of the increased price signal. So the market will work as the market will work. But the U.S. is working with our partners. USAID is right in the middle of it, and other international food organizations to get the food and to ease the price
That was a beautiful insult. The market will work like the market will work.
I'm sorry, to follow up on that, is there...
It was so insulting while being just so straightforward.
Have you considered altering the sanctions to make it clear that there's no restrictions on agricultural trade with Russia?
So the sanctions have always had carve-outs for humanitarian needs. The focus of the sanctions was to be on Putin and his close circle, but to minimize to the extent possible the impact on the Russian people. So there has been a carve-out for humanitarian aid, and we will absolutely be working to ensure that they get the food that they need.
So you just spoke about unemployment. Thanks, Andrew. I wanted to follow up on what the administration's proposed in police funding.
So 3.2 billion is for grants, local and state grants. Then the other 30 billion, the White House has called it, quote, mandatory resources to support law enforcement. What does it mean by mandatory? And how will that money flow to presumably local governments and states for police forces?
So as you know, the budget, two major spending categories: discretionary, which will go through the appropriations process. That is where we're asking for the $3.2 billion. There are traditional accounts like the community-oriented policing account and burn jag that the Appropriations Committee already funds. We're asking for increases in those accounts. The mandatory side, it is a new proposal. We would have to work with and are planning to work with the authorizers who typically move mandatory legislation on the parameters of that funding. But what is clear, and you heard the President talk about this earlier, in addition to cops on the beat, we want a community focus. We also know that it takes a comprehensive approach, that police forces around the country should have mental health services, psychiatrists. That's why our Community Violence Initiative, we're asking for money not only in DOJ and in HHS on the discretionary side. So the plan is, on the mandatory side, is a new proposal to work with those authorizing committees to ensure that it is both strong on the policing side, but also have these wraparound services.
On the mandatory side, I mean, are there any goals in terms of how many more police officers could be added nationwide, or any priorities? You mentioned a couple of them, but in terms of what you want to see this money used on, and how much leeway will police forces have versus
these are supposedly like our good journalists, right? These are our really sharp
as you know,
journalists.
these decisions are best made at the local
The best
level,
and
not
quickest to
even
go
at
against
state
the
most
presidential
often,
staff.
when it comes to policing efforts. So what we plan on doing is working with the judiciary committees to ensure that we provide flexible enough funding, but be very clear that we expect a community focus, and also that we have the wraparound services necessary, including mental health services, to make sure that we bring down violence in our communities.
And when you talk about unemployment, do you take into account the millions of Americans who have left their job? Do you take that into account?
So we're calling on MJ.
You all have said that the inflation estimates for this budget were set in November, and if the invasion were to be taken into account, the outlook would look pretty different. So should we expect an updated analysis from this administration on that front to take into account the invasion? And also,
Early Sunday morning, the Legislative Assembly of El Salvador approved a state of emergency regime following a wave of homicides in the last hours. In Russia, military authorities stated that the military operation in Ukraine is proceeding according to what was planned, and the main tasks of its first stage have been fully accomplished. The Iraqi parliament postponed its session Saturday to elect the president of the republic due to lack of quorum. Hi, this is From the South. I am your news anchor, Dio Martin. From the Telstar studios in Havana, we begin with the news. Early Sunday morning, the Legislative Assembly of El Salvador approved a state of emergency regime following a wave of homicides in the last hours in the country. The Assembly approved the measure at the request of President Nayib Bukele, who hours earlier held an emergency meeting with the Security Cabinet to address the problem. The emergency state restricts a series of constitutional guarantees in an exceptional manner and provides the government with extraordinary powers. Between Friday and this Saturday, there have been registered around 76 murders in the Central American country. In November 2021, El Salvador also registered a sudden rise in homicides that left more than 40 murders in 3 days. Bukele criticized the accusations that his government has a truce with the gangs. While in December of the same year, the United States sanctioned 2 government officials for alleged secret negotiations with the Mara Salvatrucha 13 gang. Now on Sunday, Uruguayans will head to the polls for a referendum on whether to repeal part of the law of urgent consideration, a piece of legislation passed in 2020. The LUC has 476 total articles, 135 of which will be up for consideration, covering topics like security, education, fiscal management, and public companies. The referendum is wholesale, meaning all 135 articles will be struck down if it passes. Approved in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the LUC is a hallmark reform of President Luis Lacalle Pou, whose victory in the 2019 election ended 15 years of governance by the left-leaning Broad Front coalition. Panamanian trucking companies and unions joined other sectors who demand better working conditions after concluding negotiations with the executive branch without the expected results. Representatives of trucking companies, users, government authorities, and the Transit and Land Transport Authority participated in the dialogue process. Also, the president of the Interior Transport Council, Nestor Cubilla, said the government proposal does not allow to face the high costs of daily operations. According to the Panama America newspaper, a recent poll by Gallup Panama showed that 89% of the population consider the government's role in dealing with the increase in fuel costs to be negative, while only 9% rated as positive. Peruvian President Pedro Castillo announced he will go to Congress to defend himself in the impeachment trial that will debate his possible destitution on Monday, and announced the launching of a campaign to oust his government.
Go to the Congress of the Republic because we have been summoned. We have been summoned to answer for what I know they made the Peruvian people believe, and this week, starting tomorrow, there will be a devastating campaign against the government.
Likewise, the president has repeatedly restated the anti-democratic willingness of the opposition, who plan to overthrow him through legislative means despite his victory in the 2021 general elections.
I am sure the Congress will not fall for it. There are immensely responsible congressmen. There are members of Congress who understand the needs of the people and will not fall into this type of blackmail and will not believe in this media circus.
And moving on in Latin America, the president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, responded to the controversial statements made by the head of the United States Northern Command, Glenn Van Erck, about the alleged presence of Russian spies in Mexican territory.
We have to send them messages telling them that Mexico is not a colony of any foreign country, that Mexico is a free, independent, sovereign country. We're not a colony of
Good
Russia,
luck with that.
China, nor the United States.
That's wishful thinking, I think.
The Mexican head of state also reaffirmed the policy of not interfering in the affairs of other countries, a policy traditionally adopted by his nation.
We have a policy of non-intervention. Remember what President Juarez used to say, between individuals and nations, respect for the rights of others is peace, as simple as that.
In Ecuador, an earthquake of magnitude 6.0 occurred on Saturday night in the coast of the city of Esmeraldas, reported the Geophysical Institute. The earthquake had its epicenter 11 kilometers from the city of Esmeraldas at a depth of 10 kilometers underground. The Oceanography and Antarctic Institute of Ecuador's Navy reported that the earthquake does not meet the necessary conditions to generate a tsunami on the Ecuadorian coast and in the insular region. According to local media, the earthquake was felt in several Ecuadorian cities. So far, there have been no victims reported by the event, although some minor damages as well as a power cut throughout the city. According to the National Risk and Emergency Management Service of Ecuador, the earthquake was felt in 11 of the 24 provinces of the country. Now, Chinese authorities reported that 9 earthquakes, one of them reaching 6.0 magnitude in the Richter scale, affected the northwest of the country early on Saturday, leaving no casualties or material damage. The earthquake's epicenter was located in an isolated area 126 kilometers from the city of Delingha in the province of Xinhai. The strongest earthquake with a magnitude of 6.0 was recorded at 12:21 a.m. local time Saturday, after which 8 more earthquakes followed for approximately 2.5 hours. Local authorities sent a team of 100 firefighters to the area to carry out possible rescue operations in Xinhai province and neighboring Gansu province, which are in a state of alert.
Thanks for the follow, whoever the fuck did it. Not connecting right now for some reason.
On Saturday,
for me.
the Philippines authorities evacuated hundreds of people while thousands remain on alert in the surrounding area of Taal volcano after a small eruption that caused the emission of gas and steam up to hundreds of meters. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology indicated that the main crater of the top volcano generated a short explosion at 7:22 a.m. local time Saturday that raised the alert to a level 3 out of 5 due to the penetration of magma in the main crater that can generate other eruptions. The explosion was followed by almost continuous magma activity inside the volcano, which caused smoke clouds of up to 1,500 meters high, as well as volcanic earthquakes. In this context, the authorities ordered during the early hours of the morning the urgent evacuation of more than 1,000 people in villages located in less than a 7 kilometers radius from the center. We're going to take a short break now. Please join us again after this.
I'd like to call up my amendment. Lee number 17 is modified.
Go ahead, Senator Lee.
While the COVID-19 pandemic has drastically increased e-commerce sales, the surge of online goods has exposed some problems, some systemic problems with our supply chain, introducing truck shortages, port capacity, and technology, as well as port labor challenges. Americans in all states, and not just in the coastal ones, are experiencing consumer product shortages. And the end doesn't really appear to be anywhere nearly in sight. Businesses, particularly small ones, are feeling the supply chain crunch. Unfortunately, to continue to serve their customers and employ their workforce, they've had no other choice but to increase consumer prices. further contributing to our broader inflationary pressures. I introduced a bill called the Stop the Grinch Act late last year and recently introduced an updated version of it called the Ship It Act in order to provide temporary relief measures to ease pressures experienced by carriers, ports, truckers, rail lines, and others along the supply chain, ultimately affecting consumers. I appreciate the chair's willingness and that of Senator Wicker to work with me to incorporate some of these reforms into the bill, which we've done. But I think we can still do more, and that's why I'm offering this amendment today. Lee Amendment 17 is modified, which would provide additional space for the overflow storage of cargo containers. Few can forget the images of vessels anchored off our coast, just waiting to unload. One reason the wait is so long is because we don't have enough dock space to place the containers. To make matters worse, if the containers aren't sitting on the ship or at the shipyard, they're sitting on our previous supply on our precious but sometimes dwindling supply of truck chassis, which are so desperately needed for the transportation of
previous.
goods.
I mean precious, not previous. Precious.
Amendment requires that the GSA, the Secretaries of Agriculture, Interior,
just reading fucking
Defense,
propaganda.
Jointly
What an
consult major
asshole.
stakeholders. in
I'm
our
just
supply
a
chain,
massive asshole.
Ocean carriers, ports,
I am.
railroads,
So is he.
and truckers, to identify and temporarily designate plots of federal land that we can use to store empty containers for no more than a year. Because this authority is for such a short period of time and for such a unique emergency purpose, my amendment creates a categorical exclusion from NEPA. But I want to be clear. The locations of these lands are in the discretion of the agency heads and consistent with the Council on Environmental Quality's NEPA regulations, meaning that if a designation is determined to have extraordinary circumstances that warrant the preparation of environmental documents, then the agency head must do so, not only may, but must do so in accordance with NEPA. This is not a blanket waiver of NEPA. It's only a presumptive one that can be waived easily. This overflow storage will provide a much-needed temporary relief valve to offload containers and help free up dock space so that we can unload our ships and have more efficient thoroughfare of cargo. Some projections note that our supply chain crisis could go on for another 12 to 18 months. Congress really should act now. It must act now to provide common sense measures like that found in my amendment, Lee Amendment 17 is modified, to help mitigate the worst of our supply chain crisis for the benefit of all Americans. I'm proud to have the support of the American.
I don't like him. He's corporate owned. He's Black Star owned.
On this amendment,
Black group.
and I ask for the support of each of my colleagues, and I'd like a roll call vote on this.
I'd like you to disappear. That would be great. I'd enjoy that a lot. So what was the other guy's name again? Evan McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Director Ray, for being here and for your service to our country. Like literally every other person in this room, like literally every member of the United States.
Don't need to hear him talk for any longer, right? Ever again. Oh, Evan, you have anything recent? Not really. Poor Evan. Let's hear his last year thing. 1 year ago, he is independent. He is running because the Republican Party is rotten to the core. Harsh words from Evan McCullen, independent with $1 million to go.
Call like to be taking place now with this Republican former president on trial in the Senate, where every single bit of the evidence is so fully condemning. And yet you're looking at a Republican Senate that seems to be leaning toward forgiving Donald Trump for all of this.
Well, Lawrence, thank you for having me on. And really, you just painted a picture that describes the impetus for the meeting, for the gathering. I think, together, all of us are looking at these circumstances looking at Donald Trump's presidency, the history of the 4 years of that presidency, how it really all led to January 6th. And then to see that deadly insurrection happen that threatened our democracy, and then to watch a majority of House Republicans still vote to overturn the
Is he
results
running on
of the
January
election,
6th?
and then to watch all
He's
of this
running on January
additional
6th. Fuck you.
evidence come to light, and to still learn that Senate
Not
Republicans
impressed.
will overwhelmingly vote to protect the president, even though he committed or even though he led a violent insurrection to overturn an election so that he could stay in power. All of that just describes, of course, a party that is sick, that is rotten to the core. Are there good Republicans out there? Look, I know some, but they're all deeply disturbed by what's happening and uncomfortable with the direction of the party and demanding something new. For the last 4 to 5 years, many of us have fought for a new direction. We were 10 to 15% of the party. Now we're at 25 or 30% of the party that think it's time for something new. And so we gathered people from the Bush, Reagan, even from the Trump administrations, people in elected office, now Republicans in elected office, recently, people who have recently retired as well, 120 top political and intellectual Republicans, intellectual leaders in the Republican space to talk about a new direction. And we debated about whether it should be a faction within the party or independent of the party, a pro-democracy faction, to try to pull the party back or pull the party to a position of committed to our founding values, committed to our democracy, or whether we need to start something entirely new.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and
Sorry, you didn't even get to hear that. I told Rachel, kiss my ass. I listen to her. Alright, I had a few more segments after the takedown. Want to do Russell Brand last tonight, because I want to go a few days back. Let's do Tulsi, right? I had 2 things from Tulsi. I picked something up about a week ago, never did it, and now I have something new. So let's do a few minutes of Tulsi.
Hi, this is Governor Ron DeSantis.
Oh
we
my God,
are
this
fighting
fucking
the
guy! I
good
swear to
fight
God, this guy
in the state of Florida.
This guy is in my head. I live in Florida. I'm not voting for you, dude. I'm voting against you all the way. I'm not gonna vote for a Democrat, but I'll vote for fucking any. I'm not voting for you, dude. It's not gonna happen, man. You're a jackass. Never would vote for you.
Policies. I look at it by thinking of what is actually going to improve the lives of the American people, what will make their lives better, more secure, more prosperous, more fulfilled. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that President Biden isn't doing that. He should be focused on his job as president of the United States of America and actually solving the problems that we're facing here, securing the border, making our communities more safe, improving education, strengthening our economy by supporting small business. There are a lot of problems, unfortunately, that need to be fixed. That's where he should be focused. But instead, as we've seen, he seems to be more focused on trying to be president of the world, and along with the power elite of America, taking this missionary zeal to say, you know what, we're going to set aside the problems that the American people are, and instead focus on saving the world by spreading democracy everywhere.
Yeah.
It's just a bigger version of Obama's Arab Spring, where he took his kind of messianic attitude towards trying to save the Middle East by spreading democracy, but really just left destruction, suffering, and death in his wake. And the American people paid a very, very heavy price for that.
It's about humility, isn't it, Tulsi? It's about recognizing that the American president can't just shape the world however he wants, and like usual.
Well, central to that humility, Jesse, is first and foremost recognizing you're not God. You are not in control. And if you try to pretend that you are, what will result, even with good intentions, what will result, unfortunately, is more suffering, more hardship for the people in the world that supposedly he's trying to save. but also for the American people, because Joe Biden's already told us, hey, freedom is not free. You, the American people, are going to pay the price. And that is exactly what we will see play out if he continues to think that he is and can be somehow the controller of all people and all things in this world.
I mean,
I am a little weary of taking clips from people. I'm medicated right now. I usually don't take a clip right away from somebody. If you want to, I don't know. I am going to be talking about Ukraine and Russia again. I have already talked about it today once, and I can go back like an hour ago. MacPid, so yeah, I mean, I usually bring it up, and I think I have another clip on it later. And I've already shown an interview with somebody that was in Poland talking to troops from the gray zone. So I've had at least one clip on it today. There's one more about censorship. I was going to go into censorship a little bit.
A friend told me about Every Plate, and I love it. It's only $2 a meal, and it comes straight to my house.
I was going to go to censorship to climate change.
$50 a week.
Hey, everybody. So since this morning, I've gotten some questions from people who are not familiar with the term shadow banning and are asking exactly what it is. So I want to take a minute to show you. For example, when people try to type my name into the search box on Instagram or the Discover box, my account does not show up. Whether you type in Tulsi Gabbard, it literally does not show up. I'm also getting a lot of reports from people who are trying to at my name, at Tulsi Gabbard, and mention me in their Instagram stories or posts, and they're getting a warning that says this account has posted false information. Obviously, they're not providing us or whoever's trying to post this examples of what this misinformation is or
I don't watch
what exactly
mainstream media
about.
at all.
People try to tag
official
me
Western
in
media.
an
I don't watch
Instagram
anything
post and they get
official
an error
Western
saying,
media.
"We are
So
restricting certain activities."
literally anything I would have
Our
shown would have been
community.
independent
What are they
media
protecting
news
their
sources,
community from?
not speaking
Nobody
the narrative.
knows. Another thing is just with my
I mean, if you want to put it in the
posts,
thing,
I
I'll
would
check it out
say
over here. I'm not
that
gonna
with the
I'm not gonna
numbers
put
of
it
views
on the
and
stream
numbers of
instantly.
likes,
I'll check
they're
it out.
down.
I'll look at
So,
it. If you want to throw it on the
that
stream,
just gives you a little
I'll click
bit
on it and
of
look
an
at it.
idea of what
But-
shadow banning is and what the effects are. You know, I was talking to somebody
I
else.
always check it out first before I put it on
they're
here,
allowed to do
especially
this?
when I'm medicated.
I know very well that these big tech companies have
Throw in the link.
a
I'll
lot
check
of
it out.
Congress in their back pocket. And so while you'll hear Democrats and Republicans railing against, suppression, maybe, I don't know actually what the split is between Democrats and Republicans, but you'll hear politicians railing against, the power of big tech monopolies and something's got to be done. Well, Congress hasn't done anything yet. And big tech money is the reason why. So as long as we have these cowardly leaders in place, I don't anticipate any real change. So if you are not already, I encourage you to join me at tulsi.locals.com. You'll get to see everything I'm posting directly. No chance of censorship. This platform celebrates free speech and democracy, and I encourage you to join me there or join me on other platforms whose mission it is to uphold free speech, uphold our First Amendment rights, and protect our democracy.
Hi, I am Roman Kosterev. I'm a reporter for RT. I've been working here in Donbass for the last 8 years. Probably the only journalist, English-speaking journalist, who's been working here for the last 8 years, and I showed all the hardship that the local people have to go through. And I'm really glad that now, after 8 years, we're seeing more Western journalists.
So this is Ava Bartlett talking to this person.
Pool of people, but hopefully they will get some answers as to what's been happening here. And it's not,
Right,
Russia.
that was way too
For
low.
RT, I've been working here in Donbass for the last 8 years. Probably the only journalist, English-speaking journalist, who's been working here for the last 8 years, and I showed all the hardship
Something
that
like this,
the
MacBid?
local people have to go through. And I'm really glad that now, after 8 years, we're seeing more Western journalists here. although it's a pool of people, but hopefully they will get some answers as to what's been happening here. And it's not, Russia attacking Ukraine. It's not Russia starting a war. It's Russia ending the war that's been happening here for the last 8 years. It's Russia who are putting a stop to all the suffering of the people that went through hell of the last 8 years, and hopefully this will end very soon.
And Roman, I mean, I'm aware of when you say suffering, I'm aware of what that means, but for people who don't know what's been happening here, what do you mean by suffering?
Well, over the last 8 years, I've seen children ripped apart by shelling, elders ripped apart by shelling, people hiding in bomb shelters, people who have no access to food, water, electricity. That's the kind of hardship we're talking about. We're talking about an all-out war of Ukraine against their own people. Well, at this point, they're not their people anymore because the republics have been recognized by Russia. And, I was here in Donetsk when Russia announced that their recognition of Donbas republics, and people were really, really happy. They were still being shelled. Shelling continues to this day, but now they have certainty in tomorrow. They know that Russia is with them, and they know that there's
Brought a freaking Russian independent journalist right here for you in the Donbass, but I think that person left because I wouldn't play their video with a bunch of fucking Nazi signs right off the fucking bat.
Now they know for a fact that
I gotta check my shit, yo. Can't just be throwing
And
random shit
Roman,
on here.
I've heard, and I think perhaps you can confirm, I've heard a lot of reports about mass graves being found. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I've seen those mass graves myself. I've been working here in 2014, 2015, well, over the last 8 years, and I've seen those mass graves. And, well, I'd like to tell you about one
Hey, Bisky.
where a territory here in
How you been?
was liberated. It was Aidar, a nationalist battalion that was
getting late.
They retreated, and on that territory we found mass graves. And I did a report on that. You can find it on YouTube. That was back in 2015, I believe. And I saw.
I'm doing pretty good. I'm getting ready to get out of this place.
It's really hard to talk about it.
Done with Florida.
I saw a woman. She later I found out she was 19
people
or
down
20,
here.
20 years old. She had her hands tied behind her back. She was pregnant. Her belly was pretty big.
I mean, I gotta get out of
She had
Florida.
hands tied behind her back.
Florida, man. Florida, man. Florida man shoots. Florida man beats bear. Florida man tackles gator. Florida man. Florida man. It's. I don't like winters, but I don't like Florida. It's a weird catch-22. Texas, no thanks.
For them,
at least in
this is
Florida, I can.
territory.
Yeah,
This is
Texas,
not a
and
country.
no
For
thank you.
them, this place must be either free of any dissent, any Russians, any Russian-speaking people, for that matter, because many Ukrainians speak Russian as well. So once they leave, they want to basically destroy everything. And that scene of that woman, young girl, basically, pregnant girl, who was executed for what reason I don't know, but probably for no reason at all, just because they felt like it at the time.
Were you in Donetsk when the thru
I just forgot. Yeah,
was fired?
I just have no desire to ever
10
live
days
in.
ago, I think it was.
Ever live in Texas.
Okay.
Zero desire. I like mountains, so
Yep.
if I'm gonna leave, if I'm gonna go somewhere that's gonna be cold, or I don't know. I like mountains. No, thank you on Texas.
Banks, stores, it's horrible what had happened. More than 20 people were killed as the result of that shelling. And they used it's a ballistic missile.
Yeah, they don't like.
Civilians.
And it had cluster
They're
munitions.
very interesting in Texas.
So
A state that
my
used to be
understanding
Mexico
is that
against
it was
Mexicans.
shot down, but nonetheless,
very weird
at
place.
least one cassette exploded. And can you just talk a little bit about the range of this and what is a cassette for people who don't know military language?
Well, first of all, the ballistic missile in question, its NATO classification is SS-21 Scarab, I believe. It's capable of carrying a nuclear load. Well, obviously that wasn't the case in this instance.
When you say Sandy Cheeks, do you mean the voice actor, or do you think the actual SpongeBob character lives in Texas?
Creates huge, absolutely huge destruction. Well, the cassette, basically it explodes up in the air and kills everything in sight. I mean, legs are cut off, heads.
Yeah, no, the actress or the actual. Do you think the actual cartoon character lives in Texas? Or are you saying the voice actress lives in Texas? Which are you saying here?
But it's a really terrible weapon that's, it's back from Soviet times, and unfortunately Ukraine has a lot of those weapons that they're using against people in Donbass. A missile like that landed on Russian territory a couple of days ago as well. And right now it's probably a state of agony for the Ukrainian military, because Russia is carrying out its demilitarization operation, and Russia's goal in all of this is for Ukraine to not have an army anymore, because they have been terrifying people here in Donbass for the last 8 years, and enough is enough, and Russia is here to stop this war, and for Ukraine to be neutral once again, and for Ukraine to be denazified, and for Ukraine to be a normal and a free country as it's supposed to be.
And I know you probably haven't been able to go into Ukraine.
I'm okay with those being real as long as then Winnie the Pooh's real, because I prefer Winnie the Pooh to any of that. So the Tooth Fairy is kind of creepy, actually.
But people within Ukraine
The
proper
Tooth Fairy is a little creepy.
And people who maybe if they're not.
So is the
Russian
Easter
speakers,
Bunny.
but
Easter
maybe
Bunny's creepy as
sympathize
shit.
With
I'm more scared of Easter than Halloween.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Even though you're not based there, you have the knowledge about what's going on in Ukraine.
Well, I'm banned from entering Ukraine.
Yeah, so am I. I think we're both on the same kill list.
Exactly. I'm banned from entering Ukraine, but back in 2014, there were a lot more people who were siding with Russia. But over the last 8 years, media and any kind of dissent, even within the government, was quashed. It was absolutely, banned, if you will. Like the last couple of days, 11 political opposition parties were banned as well.
Hey everybody, welcome. Hold on, fixing my sound here. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me. Please take a second to share this. Let folks
I want to share this one because it's about
hit the
censorship,
thumbs up
which
if
is
you
very
haven't
important right now.
subscribed. You can subscribe at
The world seems to be getting
youtube.com/,
censored. Everybody seems to be
Moment
getting
of
censored.
Clarity.
So.
Also going live on Rockfin. But I got a big show.
Good to see ya.
I have one of the few people I know who is
I know it's
perhaps
late.
more censored than me.
It is quite late.
In certain ways. But we'll dig into that, just how heavily we've both been censored in this neo-McCarthyist, new Cold War bullshit that we're all facing. An amazing journalist. I got to know her at RT America, but she does wonderful work. So without further ado, here's Rachel Blevins. Hey.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on the show today.
Yeah, good to see you. You and I both lost our jobs recently. RT America shut down. You were a reporter there a long time. How long were you there?
Almost 4 years. It would have been 4 years in August. So they let me get to the point where I was just getting good and then shut everything down, I guess.
Oh, don't be humble. You've been good for a while. But but and so most people know because I've talked about it on my stream. So most people watching may know about my story. Obviously, our shows were canceled. The network goes down. Same time, all of the back videos of everything connected to RT America. So Redacted Tonight, Boom Bust, all of it gets banned globally. And then my podcast was also deleted off Spotify. But your censorship even began a couple of years before that. You were part of the mass Facebook purge where they deleted several hundred pages all at once, right?
Yeah, back in 2018, actually just a few months after I had started at RT, Facebook came in, and of course, they always do it in this vague way of just saying, well, you violated our policies, but then they never tell you exactly what those policies are. And
Right.
so before I came to RT America, I had been working with the Free Thought Project, and their page was included. They lost millions of followers. I only lost around 70,000, which wasn't much compared to the other pages that had been taken down, like the anti-media as well. And so I kind of went through it in 2018 with Facebook taking down my page. And it's weird because they unpublished it. And then a week later, they came in and they deleted it altogether. So there was no way to reach out to Facebook and say, hey, you took my page down, because they made it look like the page had not existed at all. And so I kind of went through that then. And then I think it was about a year ago when it came up to the anniversary of the collateral murder footage from Julian Assange that he published that was being shared around on Twitter. And then Twitter came in, suspended my account, and said that I couldn't have it back unless I deleted the tweet that included a video of that footage. And it
Really?
wasn't even my video. It was a video that had been shared by everyone because it was the anniversary. Yeah, so I've had a few run-ins up until the last few weeks when Twitter came in with this new Russian state affiliated media label that is still on my account. They
Right,
refuse
right.
to take it down.
So for those who don't know, your account, and it's even worse on Twitter because Twitter is such a tiny little post, 140 characters or whatever, that half of it is devoted to them calling you a Russian agent. So
Yeah.
if you look at any Twitter post you put up, underneath your name, it says Russian state affiliated media. And they just added that recently, and now you aren't affiliated with RT America, yet they're not taking it off.
Yeah, exactly. They literally, I think they added it on Monday and then everything shut down on Thursday. That was how quickly it was. And I reached out to them immediately and said, okay, well, you claimed that, of course, they do it the usual way of changing their policies. And in this case, they claimed that they were going to add quote unquote prominent journalists. So I was like, well, Twitter says I'm a prominent journalist, but it certainly is not a compliment in this case, because they're also saying that if you have that label, then they will not promote your account in any way. So for people to see my tweets has to be sheerly because they are going in and sharing them. Twitter's not going to do anything on their end. In fact, it's probably going to lead to more censorship. And like you said, people who have no idea who I am, if they see that I tweet something, they're automatically going to just shake it off and not pay attention to it because they see that Russian state media label and they think that that is the case because Twitter said so.
Right. That was part of the initial goal when they started. I mean, they first put those labels on several years ago, but it was mainly on things like the Redacted Tonight official page. It wasn't on individuals. And the first individual I saw who got it was Jingjing Li, the CGTN reporter. It was several months ago, they labeled her China State Media, her personal account. So it was a new step to decide, okay, well, anybody's personal tweets are therefore directed by the Russian government. Like you could tweet out a photo of your cat and it would still be labeled Russian state media.
Yeah, and that's exactly how it has gotten to that point now. I mean, whenever they first initially did it, I said, well, wait a second, this is my personal account. I've had it long before I came to RT America. I still have it now. Everything that I tweeted, while yes, it did include content from my work, it also includes a lot of other stuff. It includes plenty of my own opinions. And it's funny because you remember that trend of everyone getting on Twitter and putting on their bios, opinions are my own, or they don't reflect my employer or whatever. Well, now Twitter seems to be saying, no, not only do they reflect your past employer, but they literally reflect another country's government. So whether I'm tweeting about my dog or my family or whatever it may be that I want to put out there, now it's all Russian state media.
And what was so, obviously I was around it a lot, but I do feel like there was two sides to RT America, as there are with any news studio. There was kind of the news department, which was busy putting out content constantly. And then there were kind of the opinion shows like mine and Jesse Ventura and Chris Hedges that were a little different, and we kind of were doing our own thing. So I kind of wanted just to get your take of how it was to work there, what what your experience was as a reporter working at RT America, of course. And I've dealt with this for, I've been there eight years, so I dealt with this for 8 years, but people being like, oh, everything you say is just directed from Russia. And I know that's not true. I was never directed to say anything. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to get your view of how it was to work there.
Yeah, sure. No, RT America was one of those networks that I was always very grateful to be able to work for because I came in pretty soon out of college. And it's funny because if you see any of the hit pieces that are written about RT, they automatically say, well, they just go after college students. They go after people who are young and have no clue what they're doing. And I like that. And I was like, well, hey, I don't think that applies directly to my case. However, I was new in the field of TV news and that sort of thing. But I also, when I was in college, started reaching out, doing freelance work. I was very passionate about US foreign policy. I was very passionate about wanting to take on kind of this media landscape because when I was in college, I saw the way in which a lot of my professors would talk about how it was left versus right, and you had to go either work for a local TV news station or try to work your way up to one of the major networks. And I was in a position where none of that seemed appealing to me. However, what was really cool was to look and to see what a lot of the independent journalists were doing at the time and really taking on and questioning that narrative. And so when I started out as a reporter at RT America, I actually felt like I had the opportunity to do that. I got to report on Yemen and Afghanistan and these issues that I never would have been able to talk about at other networks, but yet at RT America, I was being able to devote a lot of time to that. And no, I was not being told what to say. I mean, it's funny how they act as if there's some kind of direction or like we get our daily printout of what Putin says is allowed to go on TV. That was never in my experience. Obviously, you do have editors and people who make sure that your work is factually correct, and I'm always grateful for that. But in my case, when it came to story assignments and scripts and that sort of thing, I was never told any line that I had to follow or any narrative that I had to preach, so to speak. And then even when over the last year or so, I got to co-host the show Boom Bust, which is business, finance, economy, all that. And what was really cool about Boom Bust was that so much of it was unscripted. We had all of these incredible experts in the field who would come on our show and we would be able to just have a conversation. And if it went off of the questions we had written or it went off of what we had planned to talk about, we went with it and we were able to have that discussion. And it was so powerful, I think, especially in the landscape that we're in right now, where you have a Federal Reserve that has just gone crazy over the last 2 years. They have, printed trillions and trillions of dollars. They have given us as a gift, it seems like 40-year high inflation. And yet we had people on our show who were calling out the Federal Reserve from day one and talking about how they were lying to the public. And that was a conversation that you did not find on a lot of networks where everyone is, preaching about how great Chairman Jerome Powell is and trying to keep the Fed happy. We were there actually having that conversation and calling him out. And
I know it's a tangent, but I'm sure everybody would love to hear if you want to dig in a little deeper as to how they were lying to the people about what the Fed was doing and that stuff.
Sure. So whenever the pandemic first kicked off, of course, Congress gets together and they say, okay, we're going to see historic lockdowns, which means we basically need to print some money. We need to put in measures in place to make sure that people aren't thrown out on the streets. And they did that. However, they took it to another level. And by that, I mean that they spent the next 2 years not only printing money, but also working to keep interest rates low, putting all of these things into place, not for the average American, but so that the stock market would keep hitting record high after record high, so that the money would keep flowing. And of course, they justify it by saying, look, we're looking at historic lockdowns. We don't want there to be a major impact on our economy. We don't want to see this massive recession that we were headed towards before we got to the pandemic. And for someone like Chairman Jerome Powell, he got up at every monthly meeting and he sat there and he said, inflation's transitory, which is to say, oh yeah, prices are higher now, but that's because of supply chain shortages. That's because of this and that. It's not going to last for long. And he sat there and he lied to the public for months and months and months. And even when towards the end of 2021, he had to basically admit, yes, inflation is not going anywhere. These prices are going to keep skyrocketing. He did it in the way of saying, well, maybe transitory is not really the word that I would use, but maybe there's a better word to use for that. And he still, there has been no accountability there. Even in a case like with the Federal Reserve, you have had different officials across the country who were saying we need to pull back on the asset purchases. We need to start taking steps to actually combat inflation. And anyone who watches CNBC or Fox Business and they see the talk about the Fed raising rates or that sort of thing, you also have to put it into perspective, which means that they're raising rates by 1/4 of a percentage point, or even looking at doing it 1/2 of a percentage point, which basically means that they are going to have no actual meaningful impact on the 40-year highs that we're seeing all around us. And so for the average American, what they're watching happen is they're watching a Federal Reserve that is completely in the pocket of Wall Street and of keeping everyone who already is wealthy even more wealthy, and of making sure that they continue to see those skyrocketing, record highs in the stock market over and over again. And it's become even worse with the pandemic, but it's also put us into a situation where, I think for me, this was an area of news that I didn't even know just how much they were lying to us until I got in it and really got to report on it every day.
And then to dig even deeper, I did several segments on how the stock market is a Ponzi scheme. I mean, it by definition is a Ponzi scheme. It's not, it's not actually paying out to most investors unless you find someone else to buy the stock from you, which is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. If everyone stopped buying it, then it would all collapse. So, they had to create things like, pensions and mutual funds to get everybody to put their retirement into it to prop it up. But so I wanted to also get into, I know you guys covered a lot on Boom Bust, the economic show. You covered Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies a great deal. I'm wondering your thoughts on what's going on right now.
Yeah, I think it's been fascinating to see, and I will not pretend to be the cryptocurrency expert because we had really great experts who would come on and would teach people like me a lot. But I think one of the most powerful things that we're seeing right now is we are seeing an increase in cryptocurrency adoption really around the world. And in situations like right now where the United States, Russia, China, a lot of these big countries, they're looking at creating their own digital currencies, which for some people, they may say, oh, well, that looks great. That looks really, it's easy to use. Everything's right there on your phone because everything's going digital right now. But in reality, what that does is that gives your federal government unprecedented access to your money, essentially. They don't have to go through your bank. They don't have to go through an agency like the IRS. They can just target your funds directly. And so what we saw over in Canada, where the Canadian government came in and they said, no, we're going to freeze these bank accounts. That's just the start of that. Now, what's interesting is
I did some coverage of that as well. I was like, it doesn't matter where you stand on the trucker protest. The idea of them freezing the bank accounts or GoFundMe accounts, et cetera, of any type of
GoFundMe
group is
like they couldn't freeze fucking crypto.
You
can't freeze crypto.
It could be pipeline.
It's way harder.
It could be forest defenders. It could be any kind of activist group, anti-war groups that have their bank accounts suddenly frozen.
Yeah. And what was interesting was that they went after the bank accounts, and then they also went after a lot of these protesters' cryptocurrency wallets. Now, it is notable when it comes to cryptocurrency that yes, you can have, your crypto in a certain major exchange, which that's typically what they went after, the Coinbase, some of those top exchanges where it's super easy to buy your crypto, leave it there. You don't even think about it, except then you realize that those are companies that then the governments can go after. So it's kind of fueling this continued revolution, which you'll hear a lot of times crypto advocates say, if it's not your keys, it's not your wallet, which means that people need to have their own wallet, have the key to it, make sure that it's secure. And so I do think when it comes to cryptocurrency that there is a lot of power behind it, especially as everything is becoming more digital, especially as governments are gaining really more power than they've ever had before. But I think at the same time that it also takes a lot of education to go with it, to know exactly what you're getting into, to make sure that you have a good wallet, a good setup, all that. And I think that that's what it's going to take for people to really make some movement. But hey, at the same time, you've got the Russian government now kind of coming around on cryptocurrency a little bit because they're being sanctioned left and right. And so they're essentially saying, well, hey, if we can accept it in crypto, that's an option that we will consider.
Meet Suvi, the magical all-in-one countertop kitchen robot. Suvi saves you time.
So new research published today estimates that rich countries must end oil and gas production entirely by 2034. If I'm doing my math right, that's 12 years from now, in order to give the world a 50-50 chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the close of the century. This came from the UK-based Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. What does this mean? How could this be done? What is the state of fossil fuel extraction around the world right now, and where do we go with this? What do we do with this? Colin Reese is on the line with us. He's a senior campaigner with Oil Change International and Oil Change US. Priceofoil.org is the website. Colin Reese, R-E-E-S, is his Twitter handle, or at Price of Oil. Colin, great to have you again. Tell us about this report and what it, first of all, what it tells us, and secondly, what it means we need to be doing.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's great to be here. And I think you laid it out pretty well. It tells us that we are not on track to meet our climate goals, essentially, in terms of phasing out extraction. And it specifically, what this one tells us is that in order to keep this process as equitable as possible, to make sure that we have a just transition for as many people as possible, rich countries need to act first and fastest to phase out fossil fuel extraction as well as fossil fuel use.
Is that because rich countries are in a better position to do so? They can afford things like solar panels and windmills, or is it because rich countries are the largest consumers and producers of fossil fuels, or both?
It's both of those things, yeah. So kind of two pieces there. One, rich countries are better positioned to do this. They are by definition richer, so they have more resources for this transition. Not only do they need to be phasing out their own, but they need to be sending a lot of aid, grants, assistance to other countries to help them phase out as well. And then the second piece is that we are actually not in a rich country like the United States. We're not nearly as dependent on fossil fuels for the economy as many countries. You look at a country in the global south, a country like Angola in Africa. We also need to phase out extraction in Angola, but Angola right now gets a large percentage of its country's entire GDP from fossil fuel extraction. That's not true in the US. Despite what big oil would have you believe, fossil fuels are a vanishingly small part of our economy. We absolutely need to take care of the workers and the people who are caught up in that small piece, but it's not a huge sector of our business, and it's not something that we're going to have huge disruption from phasing out.
It seems to me, Colin, that the idea of ending fossil fuel extraction altogether in the United States, for example, one of the largest producers of fossil fuels in the world, by 2034, in 12 years, has a zero probability of happening. Can you speak to that?
I think it's pretty low. I think what we've also seen is that when politics shift, they can shift quickly. We know that we can mobilize very quickly. We've seen that in times of war in the past. We're seeing that in relation to the crisis in Ukraine and Russia's invasion at the moment. This is something where really it's a question of political will. 12 years is more than enough time from a physical standpoint to make sure that we wind down this infrastructure. The key piece that does need to happen almost immediately is to stop building out new infrastructure, to stop drilling new wells, to stop pouring more fossil fuel subsidies and public money into new projects. That's what the industry is pushing right now, what big oil and gas are pushing for. And so that's the biggest thing to resist in this moment is stopping the expansion. If we actually just let extraction in all current wells and everything they're already drilling, if we let that phase out naturally, if we kind of used up all the oil in those wells, et cetera, I think we'd still have to shut it down just a little bit early, but it would actually align relatively well with that path line over the next 12 years.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert on this, that most of our oil consumption in the United States is going to home heating, building heating, and transportation. And those are things that are very amenable to electrification, to, between heat pumps and electric vehicles. And that if we really wanted to do this, we'd need to throw like wartime resources into it, a couple of $1 trillion, just thrown in right now, spent over the next 12 years, might move us in that direction. Is that, first of all, is that the level of response that we would need, and have I correctly identified a target area for it? And secondly, the Biden administration proposed a $500 billion, $500 billion in their Build Back Better legislation to move us in this direction. And it got defeated by every Republican in the United States Senate, plus Kyrsten Sinema, plus Joe Manchin, these two sellout Democrats. Where do we go from here? There's
Great
a lot
questions
in there,
all
I'm
around.
sorry.
Have some answers. No, great questions, Tom. This is something, you're absolutely right. Buildings and our homes and transportation, our vehicle system for the most part, are indeed the majority of our oil consumption, a lot of our fossil fuel use. And as you say, they can be very easily electrified. This is going to require a massive investment. I don't have figures around, but that sounds about right. I mean, I think hundreds of billions up to trillions of dollars in this next critical period. Every year that we wait, it gets sort of exponentially more difficult. So that's why we think it's such an incredibly important moment for President Biden to be seizing the moment. We do need congressional action. Hopefully, the current energy crisis spurs a bit of congressional action, but there's also a lot that Biden can do on his own and to use his executive powers. There's the Defense Production Act. He can mobilize the entire resources of the federal government towards building out clean energy, towards technology, towards electric vehicle technology and weaterization and home efficiency technology.
How does he do that without funds being allocated by Congress?
Yeah, so you have government procurement budgets, which is several hundred, like tens of billions of dollars a year that he actually does have at his disposal here,
right.
And then he needs to request more from Congress. So you can get a jump start on this. You can start to shift existing manufacturing, is a lot of what it is, and then hopefully the market picks it up and we can kind of mobilize across the economy. But that initial sort of spark and leadership is what we need from the Biden administration right now, as well as, of course, more action from Congress. As you mentioned, fossil fuel industry has bought out a lot of our current Congress on both sides of the aisle in some cases. I think we need tremendous public pressure, and we also need new members of Congress. We need to make sure that the Republicans don't get control in November, and that's definitely one of the things that needs to happen.
We're talking with Colin Reese, a senior campaigner with Oil Change International and Oil Change US, priceofoil.org.
Tom has good people on. Tom asks the right questions. I don't think, hoping for Democrats is going to change real climate change, honestly. Who the fuck actually thinks that Democrats are going to do anything for climate change? I don't. Not a chance. Most of them are fossil fuel bought too, so it's not really that. No. So yeah, I wanted to. Unless again my numbers spike for some reason, I was gonna do my last clip as Russell Brand's my favorite. Big name Monday is usually my thing on Mondays. I do, some of the bigger names in news. I started the show with Veritas and fucking Tim Pool, and I'm finishing it with Russell Brand. Kind of full loop, full circle. Circle that square. Circle gets the square. And of course, we're going to get a 7.5 minute ad for a 8.5 minute clip, because that's what they like to do on fishing, which never been a fisher, not really big into that, so that's just super good advertising, guys. Good job.
Point voting if both parties are basically the same. Is this the big flaw in our system? And is there any point participating? And can it ever change? Hello there, you 5.3 million awakening wonders. I'm so glad you are joining me on this voyage. We can change ourselves. We can change the world. Do not be inhibited by the enmeshing systems of others, be they social, familial, cultural, or political. You are awakening to a deeper reality. You know you are. I know you are. Let's get together whenever we can, and I'll give you some opportunities because I'm in the UK performing. If you want to come and see me in Carlisle next week, you can. If you want to come and see me in Plymouth, Bristol, Blackpool, I do these fantastic live shows, part comedy, part meditation, questions and answers. It's an incredible experience. There's a link in the description if you fancy coming along. There are other gigs, but I can't list all of them. It'll take too long. And we've got to talk about democracy, in particular, why democracy in countries such as the ones I presume we're in. I look at the demographics. I know loads of you American, loads of you English, Australian, Canadian, although we are from all over the world. We're watching this all over the world. That's the advantage of this medium. We all know that democracy prohibits meaningful change, that both, in most cases, political parties have alliances with corporations, media organisations, non-governmental funds that ultimately lobby them into compliance with the interests of the powerful. I spoke on my podcast, Under the Skin, to Matt Taibbi, brilliant journalist. Under the Skin's podcast I do over on Luminary. It's a subscription model. If you want to get it, you can get it. Matt Taibbi explains how the Democrat Party in particular foreclosed on its principles.
I was going to do a Luke of Weird Change video too,
the
maybe.
Possibility of meaningful political alternatives forever. Stay to the end of this conversation because Matt Taibbi is a proper journalist. He told me that when he's writing stuff, he speaks to 10, 20 people before forming an opinion from a diverse array of backgrounds. He's one of those people as well that people try to censor and shut down because he's open and honest about stuff. I would say he's pretty far from right-wing. I'd say he's to the left of the Democrat Party, and that can be a hard place to be these days. Believe me. Stay to the end of the video. Give us your comments. If you're not subscribing yet, subscribe because only 48% of you do. You're going to love Matt Taibbi. You're going to love this conversation. You should consider subscribing to his Substack, but have a look for yourself for free right now.
To me, it suggests that the Democrat Party, the left, as let's call them for now, are not really connected to a direct set of values. They're in the service of the same big business interests as we always sort of understood that the Republicans were, and they have to sort of mask that by emphasising the areas where they're different in order to sort of create the impression of difference at all.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the Democratic Party and the people who vote for the Democratic Party are a little bit distinct. You can trace back pretty concretely what happened to the Democratic Party, and they got wiped out in 1984 and 1988, and the party leadership decided to make a change, led by groups like the Democratic Leadership Council, where Bill Clinton was a big figure, people like Bruce Babbitt, and their big insight was, we're getting killed in the area of fundraising when we go up against the Republicans, so we have to change our tune and start to take money from the same sources. And in order to do that, we have to change our platforms a little bit. So we're going to be socially liberal, but economically, we're going to be neoliberal, right? Which is essentially laissez-faire capitalists. I mean, or close to it. So they started taking a lot of money from Wall Street, from the oil and gas industry, from pharmaceutical companies, from all those same places. And as you say, they became basically indistinct from the Republicans on those issues. And the rest of it, the social aspect of it, was really at that point, I think, became just for show. Because if you're not really for sort of economic justice for ordinary people, then what does it really mean that you're pro-choice or you're for gay rights? It's a good thing. I'm not disputing that, but it does mean that they made a really crucial internal compromise to their values that I think has expressed itself more and more lately. And now we're seeing it come out with areas like civil liberties, which were once sacrosanct, and were a key dividing line in how we thought ourselves or how the Democratic Party thought of itself versus the Republicans. And now it's the opposite. Now, the Democratic Party is the most pro-censorship party. They're the first people to be dismissive of the rights of the accused, or any of those things, or habeas corpus. They don't, what does that stuff matter? Like, it's good people and bad people. That's all they matter. That's all it matters. So yeah, I think you're right. If they were able to con people into buying this other version of liberalism that isn't all the way, then it was never really all that stable to begin with.
Do you think that's amazing? Thanks for explaining that, because I didn't know or understand that there were internal legislative or regulatory reformations that meant that there was a fundamental shift. But even seeing how that those shifts, that crucial internal compromise, as your phrase there, mate, like has evolved from the sort of early 80s into where we are now, like bloody hell, 40 years later, and still in my lifetime. The first piece that you've described, a willingness to get funding, you can sort of see like it's living in a culture that's ideologies are ultimately economically underwritten, or the most significant decisions and the direction of power is ultimately economic. You can see how in the end that would start to shape things. But I suppose this sort of seemingly radical pivot around what seemed like fundamental ideas, as you just sort of listed, rights of the accused, freedom of speech, all these things that I didn't even really recognize till you listed them there. That seems extraordinary. I mean, in one sense, you could say that there must always have been an uneasy truce between the bourgeoisie and the working class, or the intelligentsia and the working class, and the idea that what sense in my country, and I'm sure there are a million ways in which our countries are distinct, is that in a way the professional class, people that work in big cities and work for newspapers and media and law firms, and the professional class of folk in cities, so that what it feels like in most country, they don't like working class people. Like, I've never liked them. Like, sort of think, like, there's the people that get the bins and like are sort of shouting in the streets and driving white vans and being sort of, we don't like them. They sort of a bit smelly. And like, so when like Brexit and Trump and all that came along, it's like, yeah, actually. And so the only things that, like that remain are, we will support, like, as you said, important issues, gay rights, identity politics, all things that I'm totally down with this. As I said, a lot of stuff there. One is like, is it the professional class of people don't like sort of when it, sort of working class people, and in the countries we're talking about, the majority of those working people are still like white. You can probably, you can sort of say religious and pure numbers. Is that a significant thing? Has there always been a kind of antipathy? And then perhaps as it's come up, do you think that these divisive issues that have been exacerbated by COVID, Brexit, Trump being just a couple of examples, have somehow legitimized pre-existing cultural tensions that were always there and just waiting to be somehow realized?
Did you enjoy that conversation? Did it help you to understand democracy a little bit better? Let me know in the comments below what questions you...
Okay, let's do it. All right, Ms. Saki, thank you.
Dog is at my feet. I've been on for 3¼ hours on Twitch. So after 3¼ hours, the dog is at my ass. Oh, yes. But tomorrow is NPR Tuesday, so if you have any NPR clips, that need to be debunked, that I can get mad at, I think I'm going to be doing some NPR Tuesday while working out. That's been kind of fun lately. So get a workout in while doing NPR, sit down, maybe go over the rest of the daily news while actually not listening to the NPR podcast. And yeah, so I'll see you tomorrow night a little bit earlier for the workout, for NPR workout, and probably by midnight we'll switch over to the standard form, sit down and have a protein shake and bitch about the news for a while. All right, buddy, we're going. I'm going to finish off with this comedy clip while I get, oh my goodness, him out and ready to go to the bathroom probably. And thanks for hanging out tonight. Stay vigilant, stay woke, don't fucking put your head in the sand. Pick your own niche and stay baked. Peace, guys.
Thank you so much for meeting with me today. So as you know, I'm a hired advisor to the Biden administrative team. Unfortunately, the approval ratings are not looking too good from the American public after just 1 year, and that's like the honeymoon phase, so it's not looking too good. Just going around and meeting with everybody on the administrative team just to help you with being more transparent and more effective in your communication skills with the American public, okay? So what I'd like to do is role play, okay? I'm going to pretend I'm a reporter and I'm going to be asking you some questions, and I just want you to answer the question very directly, very succinctly. Okay, great. Okay. So, Misaki, what did you eat for breakfast this morning?
Yes, okay, first I would like to note that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. According to our data, breakfast is actually the meal of champions.
Okay, wait a minute. I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Perhaps you misunderstood. Did you ever mention specifically what you eat for breakfast?
Actually, I did.
Yeah, okay. You know what? Let's try another one.
We need to move on to another question.
All right, this time I want you to focus, and answer the question as directly as possible. This one's going to be a little more tricky and a little more realistic to a question that you were asked recently, okay?
Yeah, let's do that.
There was a meeting with Harvard and the Biden administration on October 22nd regarding COVID testing. Was President Biden briefed on the outcome of the meeting, and which members of the Biden administration was part of this team meeting?
We've done a lot of what was discussed at that meeting. We expanded our testing program and our capacity. And the issue at the time was the market was not able to, at that time, launch the website that we are launching tomorrow. And
thanks again, guys. Peace out. Good night. I'm going.
Okay, wait, whoa! You didn't really answer that question. You kind of went all over the place.
Okay, maybe you didn't hear the answer because you were looking at your notes.
You have a very artful way of dodging the question.
Okay, maybe your brain had a different question than what came out of your mouth.
So we have our work cut out for us, Misaki. Okay, all right.